Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another World of Warships live stream live here from Prague in the Czech Republic. I'm Mr. Conway, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the next episode of our Armchair Admirals series, where we gather a bunch of old people who know it better to, talk shit about admirals with the benefit of hindsight. It's good fun, and we hope that you're going to enjoy it as well. Joining me today, as usual, is going to be my local guest, the one, the only, the amazing, the incredible. I'm running out of adjectives here. It is, of course, Mr. Taki. Hello, Taki.
Hello, everyone. And let me just ask you, how old are you?
33.
Oh well,
I think.
I mean, you're not that much younger, yes. Today's stream should be fun because, the topic is the Battle of the Dogger Bank, which is kind of often overlooked episode, but actually pretty important as I hope we will see today. And joining us are two very illustrious guests, and I think it's time to introduce them, right?
Who would you like to introduce first? First, Taki, I'm going to leave you the choice.
I think as first we should introduce Dr. Alexander Clarke.
Welcome.
Hello, how are we doing? It's fun to be back again, although I'm not quite sure. Again, I'm here, and again, Jingles isn't. So
yes, we already have a working theory that you and Jingles are the same person, just in different disguises. So
Or different timelines.
Or
Who knows?
yeah, or from parallel universes.
Yes. And on the other side, joining us today, our regular guest, Mr. Drachinifel. Hello.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Yes. As my Skype profile says, I'm still alive. You need better quality assassins.
But we don't want to get rid of you, right?
No, that's why you said the cheap and shoddy ones.
Yes.
Of course,
So-
we have to keep up appearances, you know.
So it's
Yeah.
it is fantastic to welcome you once again. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Alexander Clarke is a professional naval historian. The doctor is actually connected to his love of ships. And if you would like to, his upcoming book, I think you know what, Mr. Dr. Clarke, plug your book.
it's
Do you have
tribal.
it? Can you show us? Do you have
I
a-
don't have it. I don't have it yet. It's supposed to be coming to me shortly. It's being published by Pen and Sword and USNI, and it's Tribals, Battles, and Daring Class Destroyers: The Genesis of the Modern General Purpose Destroyer, and basically looks at the Royal Navy large destroyer program prior to World War II, during World War II, and after World War II, as they build what I term the back pocket cruisers of the Royal Navy. Everyone else talks about back pocket battleships because that sounds cool, and everyone, when they're talking about cool things, one concentrates on the battleships. What the Royal Navy was worried about was having enough cruisers. What they were doing was trying to use everything they could to get in as many cruisers as possible.
Okay, it seems we have
And
some
yeah,
intermittent.
it's a fun book.
There's a question. No Admiral Jingles. Yes, it seems that there is no Admiral Jingles today, and there's Dr. Alexander Clarke. So
Yes, so
suspicious.
the thing is that Jingles let me know just when I as is tradition, just when I'd finished setting up the stream, he let me know that he unfortunately is not feeling too great today and won't be joining us, so I had to reset it up. But we love him anyway, and I'm sure he'll be back next month when we will be talking about a topic that he really enjoys, and that's gonna hopefully motivate him.
You know, maybe the shoddy assassins actually worked on him.
Maybe, yes.
We kind of hope that his cats will protect him, but
And for those of you who don't know you, Drachinifel, would you tell us what you do on the YouTube / Drachinifel?
Yeah, so I have the YouTube channel Drachinifel, where I talk an awful lot about naval history, primarily 1850 to 1950, but I have been known to foray further back in time as well. You get your 3 weekly videos. You get a sort of a deep dive on Wednesdays, looking at some detail. Recently, we've been looking at the Canadian Navy, which was very fun. You get a 5-minute guide to a ship class every Saturday, and you get a dry dock every Sunday, where if you can put up with the sound of my voice for an hour plus, you get to hear me answering various questions that the viewing public have thrown at me, with occasional exceptionally long videos on.
I can recommend this channel. It is excellent. But let's get to the topic at hand.
Yes.
Right. The Battle of Dogger Bank is a topic I know absolutely nothing about. So my job today is to give smart-ass comments from the background and to learn. which I'm very much looking forward to. But I think Drachinifel was kind enough to offer to walk all of us through a brief TLDR of where, what, when, who, and how. Think of the Battle of Dogger Bank. So the floor is yours, sir.
Okay. Right. So a little bit of scene setting, as you can see from this map. Dogger Bank is not actually anywhere on land. It is a formation underwater in the North Sea, which pretty much only shows up in recent naval history twice. This battle and about a decade earlier, when a certain Russian supply ship decided it could in fact see torpedo boats and couldn't, and which led to the Russian Imperial fleet shooting up a bunch of British fishing trawlers and almost getting wiped out before they'd really got on the first step of their long journey that would end at the Battle of Tsushima. But you can see from its sort of relatively central location in the southern North Sea that it is a kind of a natural meeting place for ships coming from various directions. Now, this was not the German fleet or the Kaiserliche Marine's first foray into the North Sea. They had actually gone and bombarded a number of British coastal towns earlier in an attempt to pull off a weakening of the Grand Fleet. The idea was that these raids would provoke the British into sending out a proportionate response, and the Germans hoped that by having the High Seas Fleet waiting, sort of holding the back line, they could lure the battle cruisers and hopefully one or two isolated battle squadrons into the arms of the entire High Seas Fleet, destroying them, and thus levelling the playing field for a much larger confrontation where numbers would be about equal. This also incidentally led to the rather famous poster that says "Remember Scarborough," which I always like to say that most people in the UK would rather not.
Why?
It's a lovely town.
It's a town on the North Sea coast that they decided to turn into a holiday resort because apparently British people like going on holiday to somewhere that's even colder and wetter than most of the rest of the UK.
Well, and considering 2020 and 2021, that maybe wasn't such a bad idea in hindsight.
Yeah, quite possibly. But the thing was with those raids, although they'd managed to carry out the bombardments, the Germans had noticed in a number of these different operations that the British were showing up suspiciously quickly. And they were thinking, why is this? Now, of course, what we know now is that this was the result of Room 40 and the British, through a mixture of luck and circumstance, having made off with basically every single code book the German Navy was actually using at the time. So they knew quite often what the Germans were doing before most of the German fleet actually knew what it was doing, which, that didn't help the German efforts. But obviously, at this point, not realizing that this had occurred, the High Seas Fleet was searching around for some reason for this. And they eventually concluded that perhaps the reason was all these fishing boats and trawlers that regularly, even in the middle of the war, were going out and fishing up the Dogger Bank. And they had a suspicion that perhaps there were some intelligence trawlers floating around amongst them, which could then spot the German fleet's advances, report them, and then that would give the Royal Navy more notice than when the Germans showed up off of the English coast.
We need this in World of Warships. Deploy the fishing boats.
Yes. So
Well, the Japanese did.
The weird thing is they were actually just ahead of their time, because as we know these days, intelligence trawlers very much are a thing. But as it turned out, they were wrong, but they didn't know this. So their next big idea was to send the first scouting group out to go and harass, destroy, capture, etc. the fishing fleet, with the idea that this would then clear the way for future operations, and also, hopefully, because they thought these intelligence trawlers would be there, would also provoke the British to come out again.
Just a quick plug-in. The first scouting group were the battle cruisers, right?
Yes, it was the German battle cruisers plus SMS Blucher, the unluckiest name you can ever give to a German warship, which was
kind of overkill for fishing boats, no?
Yeah, well, the main thing was they were fast, so they could get in and out, and they were heavily armed enough that if they did get the hoped for British response, which was the battle cruiser fleet, that they could stand and fight instead of just die horribly, which protected and armored cruisers would. And Blucher was this kind of weird hybrid which originated back when the Invincible class battle cruisers were being developed because the British kept a very tight lid on what they were actually going to be. They called them Dreadnought armoured cruisers, and everyone looked at HMS Dreadnought and went, okay, Dreadnought is a battleship with the same caliber guns as the old pre-Dreadnought battleships. It's just got more of them. So the Germans looked at the official publication that said Dreadnought armoured cruiser and went, okay, so it's going to be an armoured cruiser just with lots of guns of the same caliber, which would have meant 9.2 inch. So their response was, okay, so we'll make an armoured cruiser with our armoured cruiser guns, which were 8.2 inch, and hence Blücher was constructed. And then it turned out that actually what Fisher had meant was literally the guns of Dreadnought stuck on the hull of an armoured cruiser, which was somewhat of an overkill. And that then obviously prompted the Germans to come up with actual battle cruisers, starting with von der Tann.
You might have noticed there's a small pattern developing here. The Germans keep underestimating A, the Royal Navy's tendency to steal stuff, i.e. code books, and B, they keep overestimating the Royal Navy's honesty in naming. This is of course, more recently, the Royal Navy, of course, produced the Frudeck cruiser, which was an aircraft carrier. And prior to World War II, they, of course, building the Forward Fleet Aviation Support Ship, which was an aircraft carrier. In fact, if there's one thing you can guarantee with the Royal Navy, if it's a complicated name, what it sounds like, it probably isn't.
Yeah,
Isn't that
Because it's
kind
the
of-
British, it's the British trick for avoiding the treasury. If you give it a complicated name, it sounds cool, but no one wants to ask questions because they don't want to look dumb.
But isn't that also the reason that they named the frigates, the current model frigates, because they sound smaller and therefore sound less expensive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, let's not forget the entire fast battleship case with the Queen Elizabeth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And HMS Vanguard was originally termed the fully armoured battle cruiser. Yes.
I think we are sidetracking a bit.
Yes, we are
Sidetrack,
sidetracking.
yes.
I really quickly wanted to point out that because I don't have much to contribute, I'd like to contribute the thing that I can contribute, which is to point out it is Blücher.
Blücher?
No.
Blücher.
It's soft. It's like it's pleasing. Blücher.
Blücher.
Yeah,
Blücher.
almost.
Blücher.
Yes, Blücher. Blücher.
Okay.
Und
We'll
von der Tann.
try that.
Oh,
one.
but we'll get there.
We'll
We'll
try.
get there. Okay, Drachinifel, I'll shut up again. Keep going.
Right. So yes. So the Germans are getting ready to head out, and of course, thanks to Room 40, the British are informed that the Germans are heading out. So, as with Jutland, the British actually end up leaving port before the Germans do for the Germans' own operation. And they know the Germans are heading to Dogger Bank, so off goes the battle cruiser fleet. The Grand Fleet also kind of deploys, but it's miles away, so doesn't actually take any part in this engagement. The two fleets meet up effectively fairly quickly, and Hipper takes one look at the British and goes, yeah, this was a little bit earlier than we expected. We haven't actually managed to blow up any fishing trawlers. Also, they're coming on rather strong. We should probably get out of here because
I think this is time for the second map.
I think
Yep.
it's time indeed for the second map.
There we go. So yeah, so it's starting up at the top left here. So the Germans decide they're going to head off. Apart from anything, they're hoping again that they can draw the British into the waiting receptive arms of the bulk of the High Seas Fleet. And so you end up with this tail chase. And the important thing to bear in mind is that the numbers are actually surprisingly equal. You've got Seydlitz, Moltke, Der Flinger, and Blücher.
Okay. Let me just jump in there.
Yes.
Seydlitz, Moltke, Der Flinger und Blücher.
There we go. Right. Okay. We're going to rely on Mr. Conway from now on for this. So people might be asking, well, where is von der Tann? It's in refit. So the Germans are down one battle cruiser. The British are coming at them with Lion, Tiger, Princess Royal, New Zealand, and Indomitable. So it's 5. Well, it's 5 versus 4.
Well,
Arguably.
5 versus 3.5.
3.5.
Kind of.
Yeah. But
Those are the kind of odds the Royal Navy likes. It's
you've
more
got-
used to being outnumbered, but it does like odds when it outnumbers you quite heavily.
But you've got Queen Mary isn't there because, like Wondertan, she's in refit as well. But you might also notice there's a rather large Invincible class shaped hole in that battle line, and that's because you've got Invincible, Inflexible, and Indefatigable, 3 of the I-type battle cruisers, one of which is off harassing the poor old Ottomans, and 2 of which are still, at this point, bearing in mind this is the beginning of January, this is January 1915, they are heading back up north from the Falkland Islands, having just destroyed Admiral von Spee's squadron at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. And on top of that, you have HMAS Australia, which is actually, being part of the Australian Navy and nicking Tsingtao and various other bits that the Germans had carefully acquired in the Pacific. So the British have 5 additional battle cruisers. 5 additional battle cruisers who aren't present at this engagement for various reasons. But as a result, both sides actually have kind of a fast and slow element, because the Lion, Tiger, and Princess Royal can move fairly quickly, as can the 3 actual German battle cruisers. New Zealand's all right. Indomitable is just a bit off its game, and it's not as fast. And of course, poor old Blucher at the end is not designed for this kind of high-speed operation, and is the slowest of the German capital ships. So you get this long tail chase that, as you can see from pretty much the entire left-hand side of that map, the British initially exploit their range advantage, something they would miss doing at Jutland, because the 13.5-inch guns in the leading British battle cruisers can fire considerably longer distance than the 11 and 12-inch guns on the German ships, partly because they're bigger guns and they just naturally have more range with more charge, but partly also because the Germans have designed their ships for much closer range engagements, and their guns cannot elevate in the turrets as far. Later on, they would modify them to extend their range, but at this point, there is quite considerable range advantage for the British. Beatty is leading the charge, and the one problem he runs into is, yes, he can fire and the Germans can't fire back, but at very long distances, the accuracy is appalling. So he does the natural thing and closes the range gradually using his speed advantage, which of course lets the Germans fire back at him. And both sides exchange some fairly random and inaccurate fire for most of the run. And then a couple of rather critical things happen. Poor old Seydlitz, which appears to be the pinata of the German first scouting group, gets a rather devastating 13.5-inch hit to one of its aft barbettes, which penetrates, sets fire to a bunch of ammunition. Tell me if you heard this story before. And the entire turret goes up along with the other turret in a most appalling column of flame, which basically wipes out about 200 of the crew in a matter of seconds. The only reason we don't see Seydlitz disappear under a cataclysmic explosion at this point is one very, very, very brave crewman who has the unenviable job of flooding the magazines whilst the magazines are already on fire. So he has to grab this valve to flood and open it to flood the magazines, but the valve metal is so hot it's literally cooking the flesh off of his hands as he does it. But all credit to him, he sticks with it and floods the magazines, and whilst it's absolute charnel house in Seydlitz's shell handling rooms and aft turrets, the ship doesn't explode, but a good chunk of its main armament is gone. The next thing that happens is Blucher starts to take hits because it's at the end of the German line, so it's the focus of a lot of the Royal Navy's fire. Unfortunately, with Beatty's instructions not being clear either before the battle or during his signals in the battle, again, we've heard this before, you end up with another situation similar to what you get at Jutland, where his original intention was everyone engages down the line, and his one ship advantage, so you've got 2 ships versus 1, should engage the aft ship. But the ship that's immediately following Beatty doesn't actually get this picture and thinks it should be the first 2 British ships engage the lead German ship, and so on down the line. So what you end up with is 2 ships firing at Blucher, 2 ships firing at the lead German battlecruiser, and the second German battlecruiser which is Moltke, is not being engaged at all. Somewhat shockingly, this leads to Lion, which is in the lead, taking a couple of rather nasty hits from German shells, and of course, because it's charging headlong, these hits are around the bow. It starts flooding, it starts losing power, and Lion drops out of line. Meanwhile, Blucher is also dropping out of line because it's also been badly hit. At this point, things are looking rather bad for the Germans. They get some, as it turns out, slightly inaccurate reports that they are practically out of ammunition. As it turns out, it's actually the aft turrets that are mostly out of ammunition. Because
wait a second. I saw clearly in the movie Battleship that if you run out of ammunition in the back, you can just put it on a wheelie cart and wheel it through the... No?
You could, in theory, but given that these things weigh... given that these shells weigh... I'm just trying to convert to metric for everyone. About half a ton. You could do that, but it would take you an awfully long time, and also you're wheeling live ammunition through a ship that's being shot at, which is never a good idea.
I mean, it's been done on the USS Salt Lake City in World War II, but that was a heavy cruiser, so like
yes,
100 kilos
and
versus
to be honest,
500
they didn't really
kilos.
have much choice.
Yeah.
But
it's just not a good thing to do.
No.
It's a good way to blow up your battleship.
But Moltke and Der Flinger are still basically in fighting order. Seydlitz can engage with its wing and forward turrets, so they're down to about 2.5 ships. With Lion dropping out of action, the Royal Navy still has 4 pretty much intact ships. So it's beginning to look rather bad for the Germans. But at this point, you get a wonderful mess happens. Indomitable's falling behind because, as we said before, its engines and speed aren't really up to it. So that's taken the British lead elements down to 3, with Lion out of action. Then what is possibly a spent torpedo, because the Germans have been salvoing torpedoes down the bearings to try and get the British to break off. What's possibly a torpedo that's run out of fuel pops up, and Beatty sees this and thinks submarine periscope, and immediately orders everybody to make a hard left, a 90-degree turn to port, which of course allows the range to open because the Germans don't have any such concerns and are still herring off in roughly southeast. And then he signal again with his rather inconsistent signaling, decides actually we're going. I don't want everyone to go quite that hard to port, so he signals a new signal, which is to actually turn northeast instead of north, but simultaneously hoists the signal to engage target to the enemy's rear, which it just so happens that to the northeast of the British formation at that point is the Blucher, which is falling behind from its damage. And because he signals both of these together instead of separately, under signal instructions, that means you're meant to interpret them as a single coherent order. So everyone goes, oh, right, to the northeast, there's Blucher. He's saying engage target to the enemy's rear. I guess that means everyone should engage Blucher. So just at the moment when the Germans think we may possibly be a little bit doomed here, every operational British battlecruiser goes to beat up on poor old Blucher, allowing Seydlitz, Moltke and Der Flinger to sail off into the sunset. And that doesn't end well for Blucher. There's a number of rather famous photos of the poor thing on its side. And to its credit, despite the fact it's horrifically outgunned, Blucher goes down fighting to the very last. One after another, its turrets get knocked out. It still fires with its remaining operational turret until it physically can't bear on the targets anymore. It scores a couple of hits on the British battlecruisers, although obviously 8.2-inch shells don't really do all that much. And then it eventually rolls over and sinks. But by the time everybody's gotten around to realizing that Beatty probably didn't mean such a horrific mob action, the Germans are long gone. And they end up just having to take Lion in tow and meander off, having killed a overgrown armored cruiser in exchange for heavy damage to one of their battle cruisers, and that's pretty much the end of the engagement. There's a lot to be said about Beatty's awful signaling and the fact that despite the engagement moving past him, which by all accounts, every single rule in the British playbook, with his ship disabled, he should have allowed his second in command to take over and direct the battle because he's a lot closer. He insists on continuing to try to direct the battle from the rapidly diminishing in the distance Lion, which is part of the reason all these signals are just such a horrible, confused mess. And so the whole thing kind of just fizzles out. And of course, lessons learned, the British look at the amount of ammunition they've expended in this long tail chase and go, clearly the solution is we need more ammunition and we need to fire it faster. The Germans take one look at what happened to Seydlitz and go, we probably need to update the protection systems on and how we handle our ammunition on our ships, because that was a very close call. And so in a lot of ways, this battle actually ends up setting the stage for the performance of the respective battlecruiser forces at Jutland.
And I would add there is a reason why it has that conclusion, and there is a particular officer who's involved in this and actually does contribute. We often talk about Seymour, BT's flag lieutenant, but there is another officer who is really, really not the one who should be where he is. And he also ends up as First Sea Lord. And I'm talking about Chatfield, who is obsessed with speed of fire. It's his obsession. The whole reason, and one of the reasons he gives for the sign of the King George V's in World War II should have 14-inch guns is because he thinks they will have a higher rate of fire than any 16-inch ship, so therefore they will win the fights against the 16-inch armed battleship. And you sit there and go, you are a moron. How did you get to First Sea Lord? He is a very good at talking to people. He is a lovely guy personally. He's a very nice guy. He's just an idiot.
I believe traditionally in the British Navy, it's a mixture of birth, nepotism, and having a really stiff upper lip, right?
Yeah,
no, usually. Yes, that does all help, but usually there is a sort of Darwinian selection going over it, i.e. senior chief petty officers and officers actually do weed out the ones who shouldn't be anywhere near command quite early on, if they can. I'm not sure how Chatfield got... Well, the answer is he's BT's flag captain at Dogger Bank. BT, of course, gets the First Sea Lord because of his political connections, and he does ensure that the people he's supporting get raised up high enough, and so of course one's going to end. It's just the Royal Navy's unfortunate thing that this is our First Sea Lord when we are designing the battleship which would go into World War II.
Yeah, I mean, this is a reference that probably it'll probably be lost on most other than the British listeners, but there was this wonderful series of adverts a little while ago on British TV which talked about the good-dumb balance. And they would always show something really good happening and then someone doing something incredibly stupid in the background. The tagline goes, and the good dumb balance is restored. And unfortunately for the latter part of the 19th and earlier part of the 20th century, that's basically the Admiralty. For every Admiral Fisher, there's an Admiral Beresford, and for every Jellicoe, there's a Beatty.
And so for every Admiral Henderson, there is a Chatfield.
Yes. So it's like, we produced this really excellent admiral, and the universe is like, right, great. Now let me give you someone who probably was dropped on their head as a kid, and give them some ribbon, gold and braiding.
Just quickly, somebody's asking in chat if there's a video about this battle that we're talking about. Have you made one, Drachinifel?
I have not yet. I will at some point in the future.
Watch this space.
Yes. The thing is, because it's such a smaller fleet action compared to Jutland, I'm debating whether to reuse my 1 to 6,000 scale miniatures, which I already have all the ships for, or whether I should invest in some 1 to 1,200 scale ones with slightly better detail for it. But once I've made that decision, I will get around to making a Dogger Bank video.
But generally, from talking about,
I think I might have one actually coming up. I think I have a Battle to Dogger Bank coming up on my channel. I'm going to do a profile on every single one of the battles. I'm not sure if I'm doing it as a long patrol or a live. I can't remember from the top of my head, but I do know it is coming up because Dogger Bank is one of those scenarios where you have all these battles. You've had, let's see, I've got a list of them. So we've got one in 1696, which was the war between the French and the Dutch. You have 1781, which is the British versus the Dutch. You have the Russians versus British fishing boats in 1904. 1915, you have the Royal Navy, of course, versus German Navy in this sort of battlecruiser fight. And finally, in 1916, those torpedo boats that the Russians knew were coming turn up into a fight between the Royal Navy Minesweeping Squadron and the German torpedo boats.
Okay.
So finally, those torpedo boats come.
Why?
And wasn't there actually like generally in the general area also early World War II rather infamous fight of Luftwaffe versus Kriegsmarine with the two destroyers being sunk?
Vikinger. Yes, although I don't think it's technically a battle when it's your own side.
Well, I mean, you know the drill. Like the British are the adversary and your own air force is the enemy, right?
Yeah.
Can I just ask, right? So if we go back, by the way, we should quickly have a look at the pictures that you sent us today.
Yeah.
These are ones from your own archive, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Which
all
is
the scans I sent
cool
you are photos that I have.
That you just have these pictures. But
I'm going to plug his archive because it's really good for my book.
Yes.
His picture. He provided half the pictures for my books because I couldn't go to the archives, and Drac got an amazing collection.
So my question is, right? This is, I mean, yes, there is a bank there, but it's underwater, right?
Yes.
It's literally just a patch of wetness. Why do
Yes.
people keep fighting there? I mean, if there's no discernible land
Because
mass,
it's right in between places, like it's right in the middle, so it's a perfect meeting point.
Yeah, it's almost
it's just a
central to
coincidence,
that southern part of the North Sea. And it's just, the thing is, it's just far enough away from everybody's coast that you're not going to have any particular home field advantage by fighting there. But it's also just close enough to everybody else's coast that if you need to make a sharp run for a friendly port, you don't have absolutely miles to go. Also, it's as the 1904 incident showed, it's also incredibly rich fishing grounds because it used to be above water. Way back.
I mean, it's a reef, right?
It's called Dogger Bank because it used to be Dogger Land, which was the last time that the British Isles were physically connected to the European continent. And then it flooded, but as a result of being flooded fertile soil and therefore, relatively speaking, as far as the ocean and the seas go, shallow, you do get an awful lot of fish there.
Okay,
and that's another reason you have the battles there, because the fishing boats, let's put it this way, there are quite, in the age of sail, a lot of people who are mariners and master mariners, especially the sailing masters of ships, often weren't professional naval officers. They were hired on as experts, and they'd often learned their experience in the fishing boats and the big fisheries. So they would know where they were going to Dogger Bank, and Dogger Bank was a good place to navigate by because you knew roughly where you were.
Yeah, okay.
Because you recognized the water, and then you could work out where you had to go to get there.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. On the other hand, come to think of it, since it was a shallow water, wasn't that kind of like an ideal place for minefields?
Well, it's shallow for a sea. It's still pretty deep. You're not going to go wading down in there or anything. And yeah, I mean, I think you can dive the wrecks if you get permission there, but it is going to be dry suit time. I mean, to be honest, going into the North Sea generally is dry suit time. Yeah, I can't imagine doing that in a wetsuit.
I love diving wrecks. I used to be a scuba diving instructor. Well, technically, I guess I still am. But I'd like, no way. It's too cold. I mean, I'd love to, but it's not happening.
Well, if you go to Norway, you can meet
the cold.
If you go to Norway, you can meet the other Blucher in Oslo Fjord.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's quite nice.
Yeah.
I really enjoy wreck diving. It's super exciting, if not a little bit dangerous. So let's have a quick look at the pictures we have here. So the first one, I think, is the battlecruiser Moltke, right?
Yes, that is Moltke.
That would be Moltke. I think this.
That's Seydlitz.
Then that was the Seydlitz.
Yes, Seydlitz.
Der Flinger?
No, that's Moltke again.
Ah, okay.
Okay, Moltke again?
That's Moltke, yes. Yeah, the way you recognize the difference between the two is Moltke's secondary battery runs immediately below the upper deck, and that is consistent all the way from the forecastle back to the aft turrets. With Seydlitz, you've actually got a forecastle and then a step down, and then the secondary battery is one step lower, amongst other things.
Okay.
And this is Der Flinger.
This is Der Flinger, yes. This one would be Graudenz, which is a destroyer, I'm guessing.
Light cruiser.
Light cruiser.
It's one of the light cruisers that was part of the fleet screen of First Scouting Group, and had the sense to stay very well away from battle cruisers flinging shells at each other.
But this is a destroyer here, V43.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So this one wasn't at Dogger Bank, but it's identical to a number of the destroyers that were still part of the same
Or rather,
class.
to be precise, it's not a destroyer, but a torpedo boat.
Yes. Yes, the Germans do love calling them. It's a habit the Germans have in both World War One and World War Two of calling what are effectively small destroyers torpedo boats. I think partly to intimidate the Russians.
I mean, look, there seems to be a common theme throughout the Navy is to just try and sow a little bit of confusion there. And by the way,
for the Germans, there was a rationale because their torpedo boats, they were really small for destroyers.
Yeah, I'm not saying it doesn't make sense. It is a German word after all, and it does need to kind of describe exactly what it is in some way. So there was an off-topic question here from Timotheus who was asking, Oi, World of Warships, he would like to know, what is there a ship that you like that is not in World of Warships, Dr. Clarke?
Ooh, a ship that I like that's not in World of Warships. I'm always tempted to say I'd like HMS Unicorn there, because I think a forward aviation support ship is what you need in World of Warships. It doesn't need to be it might look like an aircraft carrier to everyone else, but we all know it's a forward aviation support ship. Honestly, Governor. Ship I'd really like to see there. I think HMS Eskimo should be in there. She's a Tribal class destroyer, and I think she should have the special bonus that even if she has her bow shot off, she continues fighting. Because HMS Eskimo lost her bow 3 times in World War II, from memory. Twice from enemy action, once from someone smashing into it, which happens to be an Allied battleship. And she still carried on fighting and served through the whole of World War II. So I don't think any other ship could be quite that sort of suicidal with part of its structure.
We'll keep that in mind, but can I just point out that I think if there's a collision between a battleship and a destroyer, it's unfair to blame the battleship.
Oh, I would agree, but in HMS Eskimo's case, we will blame the battleship.
Okay,
To be fair, she wasn't moving at the time. The battleship was. It was in harbour.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Okay, so we have a rough idea of the battle now.
Just before we dive into the questions,
yes.
Just as we were talking about the lessons learned, it kind of sounds like the Royal Navy learned exactly the wrong lessons. German Navy learned generally the right lessons, except the very important lesson that someone is reading their mail, right?
Well,
it depends.
To be honest, when you look at it, you've got BT is in charge of one fleet, HIPA is in charge of the other. Who do you think's going to learn the right lesson? Who do you think's going to learn the wrong lesson? Yeah. HIPA is a superb commander of battle cruisers. BT is probably a decent commander of gunboats.
He's a very good dancer.
That's about it.
And he rides horses excellently. He is a great hunter. He is absolutely brilliant at wowing the wise politicians.
So if ever the Wilhelmshaven froze over and we needed a cavalry charge to take out the High Seas Fleet, BT is your man to go. But if you're actually going to fight the High Seas Fleet on the high seas, BT is probably one of the people you should keep as far away from that engagement as humanly possible.
And this is where another name enters the conversation, because I've talked about Chatfield. Now, Chatfield is BT's flag captain at Dogger Bank. When BT eventually becomes Admiral of the Grand Fleet and takes over after Jellicoe, because he just has the politics to do it, he gets given a new flag captain, a gentleman called Osmond de Broek. And de Broek is... he's the captain of Princess Royal at Dogger Bank. And as we all know, whilst the battlecruiser squadron draws the idea, and battlecruiser fleet draws the idea that they need to fire more shells and fire faster, Jellicoe and the Admiralty developed this idea very quickly, though people are BT's not sure where it comes from, that actually they need to work on their accuracy, and that's why you start having squadrons being rotated up to the Grand Fleet and the Queen Elizabeth come south to sort of try and work it out. The person who organizes this is De Brock, who basically goes, we were useless. We shouldn't have been firing. We couldn't fire at anything. We were terrible. I give no time for gunnery practice. My gunners couldn't hit a barn door with a paintbrush, basically, in a nice report. And so it's really kind of interesting because this other report that sort of gets filtered in through the back channels. And so there is a learning going on, but the learning on one side is different than the learning on the other. And it's also interesting that looking at what Princess Royal does later in the war and what various things this officer achieves. The Royal Navy does actually learn some of the right lessons, but because the way they're learning them is not through the official channels through BT, because BT's not learning them, and he's got Chatfield writing his reports, and Chatfield just shouldn't be anywhere near writing a report. This is what happens. So you have a sort of, again, the Royal Navy structure does tend to find a way of balancing out. It just takes time. And unfortunately, by the time Jutland happens, they haven't had a time for the second strand report to balance out what is the official report.
Yeah, the official report always has to be very positive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
And
How it
to
goes.
give you some idea of just how bad the gunnery was on the British side, if you exclude the hits on Blucher, most of which took place while she was pretty much stationary, total hits scored by the British on the other three German battlecruisers, 6. 3 on Seydlitz, 3 on Der Flinger. Moltke just sails off going, ha, can't touch me.
How many shells?
A lot.
Tiger expends 355 shells. Lion and Princess Royal average about 250 to 260 shells expended, and New Zealand and Indomitable bring up the rear around about 140 on average between them.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Germans in exchange, they get more than 6 hits just on HMS Tiger.
And
Blucher lands a hit on Indomitable, and Lion receives a grand total of 17 hits. Which somewhat explains why it's not going anywhere very fast by the end of that battle.
Which is that's kind of weird that the Lion, despite these numerous hits, suffered only 1 death, right?
It's the number. 1 killed, 20 wounded. The number of hits. The number of people that actually get killed when these shells hit actually tends to be relatively low, unless something goes absolutely spectacularly wrong, like on Seydlitz, because of this tail chase, where you tend to get the biggest casualties when something isn't burning horribly out of control is usually when you get a hit amidships, because that's where you've got the secondary batteries, which are packed full of men, or the superstructure where people who would otherwise be out and about on deck have taken shelter, neither of which are particularly heavily armoured. But in a tail chase, almost all the hits are either going to hit the bow or stern, depending on where you are in that chase. And there's not an great number of people in the bow or stern. And so casualties remain relatively low.
Okay. That
Yeah.
sounds like a reasonable explanation.
Yeah. The other thing that helps is that the German shells are 11 and 12-inch shells. They don't particularly have the world's greatest armor penetration just because of their relatively small size. So any of the really heavily protected parts of the British battlecruisers, especially at long range, are generally okay. But the flip side is, although the British have these heavier guns, they have fuses that really don't work very well, and this will be a problem at Jutland as well. And so, outside of this, the lucky hit on Seydlitz's barbette, most of the time those shells are, although they've got the theoretical potential to punch deep into the German ships and explode, they tend to explode either on contact or shortly after contact, which means that most of their force is vented into the atmosphere rather than into the ship. And again, the crew aren't dumb enough to be sitting right behind the armor plates and right on the outside of the ship. They're taking shelter deep inside the ship where they can. So it keeps casualties low when you're in this tail chase environment.
The fuses are actually another thing that the official report from BT and Chatfield and that sort of staff tries to lay some of the blame on, in that they say there needs better quality control. And actually, broadly speaking, British quality control does get better after this, and the fuses do get a bit better. They get a lot better after Jutland, but they do get a bit better after Dogger Bank.
It's fundamentally the design is flawed, which hilariously enough, again, slight tangent, but shows you some of the way the politics changed so radically in the run-up to World War One. Up until the mid-1900s, British shells carried Krupp fuses. Shockingly, when the naval armament race started, Krupp stopped selling fuses to the British, so they had to invent their own, and they hadn't done that for about 2 decades, and the one they came up with didn't really work very well until they came up with a revised design. Well, actually, Jellicoe realised the problem, came up with a revised design immediately pre-war, got promoted away from being Third Sea Lord, and his replacement decided this wasn't an important enough thing to carry forward.
Oh.
And his predecessor as Third Sea Lord, I think, was it successor? Is Archibald Moore? Is of course Archibald Moore. I think is his successor, and as Third Sea Lord, and is of course the second in command of BT at Dogger Bank, mainly because the wonderful Jellicoe, after hearing he'd stopped his fuse, had possibly suggested that if he was put anywhere under his command, he wouldn't get more than a rowing boat. But he was, of course, good friends with BT.
Yes. Which is, a good way to get promoted, but not a good way to be successful in actual battle when it comes to the Royal Navy.
Okay.
There
was a question, if you'll allow it.
Probably should actually answer some of these people's questions.
We should probably go to the question, yes. Get questions general. But the question was, why didn't the German destroyers conduct a torpedo attack to force the enemy to run away? It worked at Jutland. Did BT have more balls than brains, or was the German attack at Jutland the result of the experience at Dogger Bank? Good question.
From Mr. Mud Marcus.
Yeah, they did actually try a torpedo attack. This is one of where the possibly where that torpedo that popped up and gave BT such a fright that made him turn away came from. But the German destroyers that were present, or torpedo boats, they were coal powered, and the Germans didn't have particularly good coal. And when you've got charging battle cruisers coming headlong at you, and bear in mind on the other side of that chase, because you've got the British sitting on the starboard aft quarter, and on the port aft quarter you've got British cruiser squadron. If you tell your destroyers to turn back and effectively have a closing speed of about probably pushing 60 kilometers an hour, they are going to end up in range of every British gun possible very quickly, and they do not have the speed to get out of that engagement very quickly, which means that you could try and launch a close range torpedo attack, but you would effectively be throwing away every destroyer in your flotilla, and for possibly not all that much success, because it's a chase engagement, you'd be launching bow at targets that are almost entirely bow on, which is a much harder target to hit than broadside target. So at Jutland, the two battle lines are sailing roughly parallel, and that means not only do you have much easier targets, but it also means that you, as a destroyer, you can duck in, launch your torpedoes, and get back out again, as opposed to basically sailing down the enemy's throat and then finding you don't actually have the speed to get back out of that gun range.
Plus, at Dogger Bank, the two Royal Navy commanders really would have made that happen. You have Tritt and you have Goodenough as your cruiser and your Harwich Force commander. Goodenough is in charge of a cruiser squadron. I think it's second, isn't it, from memory? And then there's Tritt, who's leading the Harwich Force. There's also some of what's his name's memory. One of my favourites. Some of Key's submarines in the area. That's one of the reasons why I think possibly BT presumes the Germans have submarines in the area because the British have some submarines in the area. But when you consider who exactly the Royal Navy's got in charge of the light forces, i.e. the light cruisers and the destroyers, if the Germans had given them half a chance, they would have been straight on them. And it's one of the saving graces for the Germans is that they do keep out of the range of the British light forces. Because I think, how do I put this politely? There are officers even in the battlecruiser force who seem to try and not ignore BT's commands, but reinterpret them creatively.
This is what the Admiral meant.
Yes.
Yeah. What Good Enough and Twit would have wholesale ignored, in fact, did wholesale ignore senior officers when they decided they wanted to do something. Because, again, Twit could claim, I'm Harwich Force Commander. So I'm a Force Commander, you're a Force Commander, because you're in charge of the Battlecruiser Force. Then there's the Grand Fleet. I'm the third Force Commander. You know, yes, you're outranked me, but it's my independent force. And it's enough of a grey area, and he's successful enough, he could have got away with it, probably.
And just to underline this, what the Harwich force was, it was 3 light cruisers and 35 destroyers against 18 German light destroyers. So that would be not really a good matchup for the potential close-in attack.
No.
And remember, the Harwich force are the force which are trained up with the purpose of blocking the channel. Their job is to make sure that there might be some pre-dreadnoughts and HMS Dreadnought wandering around in the channel to back up the minefield. But if any German minesweepers trying to get at the minefield, or even worse, the High Seas Fleet tried to charge that minefield, their job was to do whatever was necessary to buy time for the Grand Fleet to get there. So they were very well trained, they were very well drilled, and they were incredibly motivated. And in many ways, they're a forerunner of what becomes the Royal Navy destroyer force in World War II, in that they consider themselves an elite force in a way. And it's because of the Harwich Force legacy, because you have this destroyer force which is operating, and they're not operating as adjuncts to the battle cruisers or adjuncts to the battleships or this, that. They are operating as an independent force of fighting ships. And it really sort of ingrains in the Royal Navy. And at this battle in Dogger Bank, Twit is absolutely gnashing his teeth trying to get at the Germans and trying to get round Beatty.
Unfortunate name, that though.
Yes,
but
the other thing you've got to bear in mind as well is that this wasn't. It looks very much like a headlong retreat, and to a certain extent it is. But there was a method to it. This wasn't Hipper just going, "Oh no, Beatty, run away." This was Hipper trying to draw Beatty into the High Seas Fleet if he possibly could. And if he could, yes, in theory, if he'd wanted to throw his torpedo boats into a suicide charge, he could have done so. Maybe he could have hit some ships. Maybe he could even have sunk some ships. But that would have forced the British to break off, at which point the risk and return would have been, we've lost maybe a dozen plus torpedo boats. Yeah, we've taken out a couple of British battle cruisers, but as I pointed out earlier, the British had plenty more that weren't there they can bring in. Whereas if he doesn't do that, if everything goes right, he can draw the entire battle cruiser fleet into the arms of the High Seas Fleet, and wiping out 5 British battle cruisers for probably minimal losses at that point is a lot better of an outcome if he can engineer it.
But there's also the potential that if he did that, Lion is at the front of the line. So Lion could have taken quite a few torpedoes.
Yeah, well,
I'm sorry for the crew.
Jutland probably could have gone a lot better. I would officially at this point like to file a complaint with the gunnery officers of Derflinger and Moltke that you didn't hit Lion hard enough.
Yes.
Okay, that's escalating.
Yes.
Gentlemen, should we head over and have a look at the submitted questions?
I think we should.
Yeah.
We should, yes. For those of you who are unaware how this works, 1 week at T-7, basically, D-7, sorry, we launch a portal article announcing the week's topic and also giving you the opportunity to fill in some questions, and I guess then have a couple of days to research them, so they can actually give you like a well researched, productive answer. So we'll go through these. If you have any more questions that are relevant to like the question we're talking about, please feel free to throw them in, and I'll try to bring them up. Otherwise, if it's something unrelated, hold it for the end of the questions, and I'm sure we can get to. Well, look, we can attempt. I've got 15 questions, so this may take some time. So question number 1 is from Sarah Khan, who's asking, why did the German High Seas Fleet never try to go for a decisive engagement and break the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany? An unused fleet is a useless fleet.
Basically, they kind of did a few times, but they, as we were talking about earlier, they had this idea. They knew that the Royal Navy with the Grand Fleet outnumbered them, and therefore trying to go for a decisive battle straight up was not going to work out for them. I mean, even after Jutland, Scheer's report back to the High Command basically adds up to, let's never do this again, because that was a thoroughly silly idea. Because he's ended up fighting the entire Grand Fleet. They want to isolate, ideally, the battle cruisers and a battle squadron, wipe that out, then go for the decisive engagement. Because if they do that, then they actually have the advantage, because they'll have roughly equal numbers of dreadnoughts. And if they've managed to wipe out the battle cruiser fleet ahead of time, then the Germans have battle cruisers, the British don't, which means the Germans will be able to break the British fleet screen. They'll get all the reconnaissance information they want on the British. The British won't know where the High Seas Fleet is until it shows up, and that will allow them to position themselves more favourably, and also obviously means the battle cruisers can clear away light cruisers and destroyers, thus enabling a mass torpedo attack without too many heavy losses. But because they never managed to accomplish that reduction of the Grand Fleet in the first place, apart from Jutland, which they say Scheer really didn't want to be fighting that particular kind of engagement, they don't end up going for that again. The High Seas Fleet will sortie a few times, but when they hear the Grand Fleet is out, they usually make a hasty retreat. And the one time they actually get around to saying we're going to go out and we're going to fight them no matter the odds in 1918. Okay, by that point morale has collapsed somewhat, but even so, large numbers of crew on the battleships that will be doing the fighting, the dying, and the exploding turn around and say, "Yeah, we're not so keen on that. I don't think we're actually going to sail." And you get the Wilhelmshaven mutiny.
And also, you have to remember that the Royal Navy are kind of good at repairing their damage and their losses. So if you do manage to, you have to arrange things so you can have those battles in quick succession. So you can take out the battle cruiser force, and then manage to withdraw, rearm, repair. So you take minimal damage taking out the battle cruiser force, and then take on the Grand Fleet. Because if you give the Royal Navy any time, they've got pre-dreadnoughts they can call in. They might have other ships around the world. They have ships which they're actually building at a faster rate still. They're not launching as many as they would normally be launching in peacetime, but they're still building them. They have them on the stocks. They'll accelerate them. So any time you give Britain to recover, the advantage you have won will act against you. And they will be rebuilding and rearming and gaining more strength.
Yeah,
so
and bear in mind,
this is the problem for the Germans constantly, because they've got to work this out. They've got to make sure it's a 1-2 punch, but they've got to make it a rapid 1-2 punch.
And you've also got to bear in mind that even though the Royal Navy has command of the seas generally, so you might think, oh well, if the Germans lose the High Seas Fleet, it doesn't change much materially in that term. Yeah, it doesn't change the fact that the British dominate most of the oceans, but it would change the fact that the British are having to concentrate the vast majority of their battle fleet in the North Sea. There's an awful lot of other places the British would really like to visit with some high explosive naval guns, and they can't because they're having to focus on the High Seas Fleet. There's the Baltic. Fisher really, really wants to go there, although that's probably not the world's best idea. There's Gallipoli, which is for the first few years of World War I, crying out for some additional naval shore bombardment support. And to be honest, there's even the Western Front. The Royal Navy puts a series of monitors into play to bombard the German trench lines and fortifications and supply depots to try and open a breach for the infantry to advance. But they're somewhat successful, but obviously not successful enough to actually rupture the lines. But there is a difference between a handful of monitors armed with some obsolete 12-inch guns and, 20-plus dreadnoughts.
Basically, the difference is you're turning up with heavy artillery or you're turning up with Armageddon.
Hmm.
And
So
if you turn up with, the British could start doing amphibious operations. They could do a lot of things if they could get rid of the high seas fleet. So that's your other problem. You can't afford to lose the high seas fleet in your gamble, because then the British suddenly have access to all sorts of places. I agree, Baltic, not a good idea. But again, if the British could find some way to start getting regular supplies through to Russia and help keep Russia going, that is a big problem, would be a big problem for the Germans, because they'd be back to fighting the two-front war. And their whole last offensive in World War One is based on the idea they no longer need to fight a two-front war because they've beaten the Russians. If they hadn't had that there, because the Russians had still been in a war, then they'd have never had any last offensive.
Okay. Let's move on to the second question. From Sloppy Bear, who's asking, having one's codes circumvented seems to be a reoccurring theme for Germany. Did anyone in the German high command suspect that their codes have been compromised, or did the consensus focus on a physical spy at work?
It always focused on a physical spy at work. It seems to be a consistent thing with the Germans that they have a lot of faith in their science, and they have very advanced science, very advanced engineering, and they believe their codes are impenetrable. And they forget that the British nick anything which isn't tied down, and B, that the Polish are very good at maths as well. You don't need to have a large army to produce good mathematicians. You just need to be lucky. And the British have fairly good mathematicians. The Polish have very good mathematicians. And also, it's going to sound strange, but the Germans seem to be in both world wars rather noisy. It's going to sound strange. It's not. You don't always need to break someone's code to know where they are because they're radios. The Germans always seem to be broadcasting a lot and B on high power, and it's always the same. Whereas the British, they're quite confused when the British are, because they hear the British signal and it looks weak to them, so they presume the British are miles away. And actually, it's because the British are transmitting on low power because they don't need to go that far. And you sort of read the history and you go, okay, you've gone through this in World War One. Then in World War Two, the same thing happens. And you sort of go, you are so confident in your technology, at no point do you take the point to think, hang on, that might be broken. Or they might, the other side, or give the other side agency or credit for their technology.
Yeah, the other thing is the British were very sneaky about their acquisitions in both wars. In the First World War, it's code books. In the Second World War, it's Enigma machines and various other bits and pieces. But whilst they have their suspicions, one of which is what leads to this whole battle, the British are very, very cagey, in some cases actually too cagey, about how they use the information. So if you would think, if I can read all the enemy signals, I can perfectly mirror match everything they're doing and I win, except that is a very obvious way of letting the enemy know that you know exactly what they're doing, and there's only one way you can know that. The British realise this, and so they are very, very parsimonious about how they dole out the information from Room 40 in the First World War, Bletchley Park and other places in the Second World War, specifically to make it look like it's patchy information that they're potentially getting from other resources. As I say, sometimes they do make that call wrong, and they actively don't use information that could have benefited them quite significantly. Then again, this will come back to bite them in a big way at Jutland. But yeah, it's not just that the Germans are sitting there going, "Oh no, our codes are invincible." If the Germans thought in World War II that the British had an Enigma machine, or if they thought in World War I the British had their code books, they would have changed what they were doing. But the British made great efforts to ensure that the Germans didn't think that they had those things.
And that is true. That is definitely the case. But I would also argue there's part of me when I'm looking for it. And I know this is looking at it back and you always have 20/20 vision when a hindsight. But there is still enough going on. It's one of the interesting things is the Wolf Pack does change its the submarine force does change their codes in World War II, and then there is a significant time until the British get the codes again, and you sort of go, okay, so they're learning, and they don't then do the change again, and you go, why? You found it worked, but they're either. Let's put it this way. I know that the British are parsimonious, yes, but the British don't keep. They're rolling enough sixes that it should start crossing the Germans' minds that perhaps the British have managed to load the dice.
Yeah.
Actually,
difficult
when did the existence of Room 40 and the decryption, when did it become public knowledge? Was it already between wars or only after World War II?
Bits of it leaked out in the interwar period, but the full picture wasn't released until well into the Cold War. It's the standard British secrecy laws. I mean, if you look at official accounts of the naval fighting in World War One, even the British ones, even in the 30s, and to be honest, even some of the post-war ones, there's a bunch of stuff where they talk about, we knew that the Germans were doing this, this, and this, but it's either, well, I know from talking to this officer that we know that they were doing this, but we have no idea how we knew that we were doing this. Or some of the more official ones will kind of throw it off and say, oh, yeah, we got this from an intercepted signal or some intelligence we gathered on the ground or something like that. But with that said, knowledge of Room 40, I think over about the 50 years following the First World War, it comes out at a gradual rate, as opposed to Bletchley Park, which basically no one had any idea existed for a good half century.
Yeah, that was kept super, super secret, right?
Mm.
Okay, I think there was another question in that vein anyway. Let's have a look at the next one. Yes, there we go. So Todd EU Forever is asking, if the communication between Room 40 and the Admiral were better, how would this have influenced this battle?
They didn't even want to trust Jellicoe with the information from Room 40 under. Why would you trust Beatty with the underloaded information from Room 40? If you don't want to even trust Jellicoe, let's be honest, Jellicoe, the most adventure he does is go and play golf in Scapa Flow, on the golf course he has in Scapa Flow. It's not going to get anywhere. Beatty likes to go out and party and celebrate and drink and go all sorts of places. Do you want to trust him with information? No. Seriously, though, would Beatty have believed it? That's the question. Because would Beatty have been told enough information to believe it, or would he have just been told, this is what we believe is happening? And then Beatty would have probably gone, but I'm Beatty, I know better.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't think Room 40 information would have helped dramatically at Dogger Bank, because the information they did have, it got Beatty to the battlefield. It got him on the tail of the first scouting group. It's kind of at that point over to him. There's nothing once that tail chase starts that Room 40 can tell Beatty that he doesn't already know. And it's not exactly a German state secret that a British admiral whose flagship has been disabled and is now miles behind the actual battle should probably let someone else take over. So most of the failures towards the end of that battle that result in this sort of very, very scrappy partial victory are entirely Beatty's failures. So unless Room 40 was sending out something like Admiral Hipper thinks Admiral Beatty is a moron and should have let Princess Royal or Tiger or literally anybody else take over, there's not a lot they're going to do to improve the outcome of Dogger Bank.
Yeah, you see, the literal thing is, theoretically also, again, that you have to remember his second command was Moore. I'm not sure how much of an improvement Moore would have been over Beatty. He would have probably kept the fight moving. But
you could at least see what was happening.
You never know. He might have lost complete control of Tritz, and then Tritz would have gone off and done whatever, and probably some of the battle cruisers would have followed him. But, the thing is, he could at least kept up and kept the fight going.
There's a question from chat, actually, I think it's interesting, from Trimokol, who's asking, how did Beatty not get fired? well, he won the battle.
Politics.
Yeah.
Yes,
But
politics.
also, you know, like he I mean, it may not have been a glorious victory, but it was a victory.
Yeah, well, it's a factor. It's a combination of two things. One, after action reports to establish exactly what happened do take a while to compile. So figuring out where the failures lie is not something you're going to immediately know. And secondly, because you get a lot of this question around Jutland as well, as Dr. Clarke should point out, politics. Beatty was phenomenally well connected, and because of that, and because of some of the stuff he'd done much earlier in his career in gunboats and such, like especially in the Egypt campaign, avenging Khartoum and all of that, he had a certain amount of public image, public reputation. So for the Admiralty to then turn around and just chuck him out or take him out of the line of succession for command of the big forces, they would have to have made a fairly detailed explanation to the public why this sort of new Nelson has been taken off the front lines, which, given that there's a war on and the last thing they want to be doing is admitting to everyone, including the Germans, that the guy we gave our most expensive and fastest capital ships to was actually an idiot, they're not going to do. Between the potential morale impact and his political connections, which would have fought tooth and nail to stop his reputation being ruined in that way, it would have, even though it potentially would have improved the command efficiency of the Royal Navy, it would have probably destroyed morale and caused massive divisions within the Navy.
So what you do instead is you promote him and you give him a decent flag captain who's basically either going to argue with him or wholesale correct what he says.
Yeah. Promote him beyond the level at which he can do any damage.
First Sea Lord,
Amazing.
but he does damage there. We won't get into the damage he does as First Sea Lord.
But somebody was saying here, if Beatty had been worse at doctoring his own image and spinning the history to support himself, he would have been lucky to be fired. And the Royal Navy like to execute admirals every now and then to keep up morale.
We only did it once.
I would make an exception for
We're not
Beatty.
like the French Navy. They executed a whole lot just for being toffs. But, we only executed one. The rest we fired or lost in various inventive ways. The favourite in this period was to post you as a governor to a particularly inhospitable country.
Yes. Then the British were in control of a lot of those, weren't they?
Yes.
Okay, let's go to the next question from Misfit Monk. What were some general technical advantages of the nation's ships? For example, something like German ships had accurate artillery, but the Royal Navy had the advantage in terms of range. I think we actually talked
we
about
kind of
exactly
touched on this, yeah.
this already during, yes.
So very, very quickly, if you compare like with like, as opposed to newer ships with older ships, generally the British ships were slightly faster and had heavier guns. The German ships were considerably better armored. The British had more advanced fire control equipment in terms of having centralized director firing and fire control computers. The Germans were lagging a little bit behind, not in understanding the technology, but in distributing it to their fleet. Because the two sides used slightly different forms of rangefinder, you had this slightly odd thing where the German rangefinders were more accurate to start with, but they needed a specialized crew to operate, and you had to have basically your brain and your eyesight had to work a particular way to be able to actually properly use a stereoscopic rangefinder.
That sounds very German.
Yeah, and it's very taxing. So with stereoscopic rangefinders, you can operate them very well for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then it feels like somebody's put a clamp on your head and started to squeeze. So
basically, you get the worst migraine you can possibly imagine, and and it has been known to have people actually collapse because it can get so bad in training.
So your German accuracy will start off very high and then drop off over time. British accuracy will be less to start with, unless you have a crack gunnery crew like on Iron Duke, but it will stay consistent over time. So the longer the battle, it favors the British. The shorter the battle, it favors the Germans.
That seems to have carried over to the World War II as well. I mean, if you look at a lot of the fights starting with River Plate, you have generally very accurate gunnery early on from German side, and then quite a
Yeah.
quick drop off. Were they still using the same?
Yes, they were still using the same kinds of rangefinders on both sides. Because remember, radar, although it was present on some ships for surface search, actual proper gunnery fire control radar doesn't come in really until the mid-war. And even then, its operation is somewhat patchy, so they're still using optical rangefinders for a good chunk of it. The other thing, we mentioned the range issue, the fact the British could outrange the Germans. The other big technical difference when it comes to the range finding, however, which also helps with the German accuracy, is that because a lot of the German ships didn't have fire control computers, they would use multiple rangefinders. So the British would use one, maybe two rangefinders and work off of that, feed the data into the fire control computer and get a solution from it. The Germans actually had quite a unique way of doing it, where they would take estimates from 5 or 6 different rangefinders on different parts of the ship, bring them all together, and then look at them and go, right, what's the average? Where are the outliers? And remove the outliers and then go for what the average told them, which actually turned out to be a very good way of getting an accurate range very quickly, especially when you've got good quality stereoscopic rangefinders.
But as I said, it does wear off after a while. It's incredibly accurate for the first 15-20 minutes of the fight. And if you have a second team you can put in, that's going to keep you going for about 20 minutes longer. But any time after that, you're going to be having a lot of trouble and a lot of people down with migraines. So it's one of those things. It's going to sound strange. The Germans have gone for what I would call the perfect engineering solution. The British have gone for the good enough solution. And the reason the British have gone for that is because they can use the same amount of personnel in terms of trained personnel. So they have, damage. They can relieve them if they get damaged, because they do consider rangefinders an exposed position. And so they can sort of relieve their posts, and they can keep the fire control computer going. Whereas the Germans, and this especially after Jutland and various other battles, you often find a lot of the casualties they do take, if they do take casualties, are actually in those exposed fire control positions, and that of course has consequences for later on, further on down the line.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'd point out is also the coal. Although it's not technically a machinery element, the British have a huge advantage because of practically everything at this point is coal powered. They have access to Welsh coal, and to a certain extent also coal you can get in the north of England and southern Scotland, which is high quality anthracite coal, which is very hard, very high energy, and burns fairly cleanly. So you can get a fair bit of power out of it, and it won't clog your engines very quickly. The Germans, unfortunately, natural German coal deposits tend to be very bituminous coal, which is sticky, horrible, evil stuff, which burns with vast, vast clouds of black smoke through incomplete combustion and soot, and clogs engines, grates, and boiler tubes like there's no tomorrow, which means that A, you're not getting the power output from it that you can with anthracite coal, and B, if you're sailing at high speed like they were here and like they would at Jutland, after between 6 to 12 hours, depending on the ship and exactly how hard you're pushing it, you've basically clogged your engines and will be moving slower than a pre-dreadnought while you try and clear it all out. And obviously, trying to clear out a boiler that's just been on fire for the last half a day is not the world's nicest task. And this is why when you look at pre-war, when the Germans could import high-quality coal and use specialist stokers and get onto really nice running areas for their ships, you see some of their battle cruisers doing absolutely phenomenal speeds, sort of very high 20s of knots, flying down these courses. But when you get into the actual war, when they're forced to rely on this much nastier stuff, now all of a sudden their apparent top speed has dropped by 3 or 4 knots, and they're really struggling.
And it's also, and the British are also the ones moving on to oil. You've got the Queen Elizabeth class coming through, which are oil fired, and that isn't because the British don't have good quality coal. It's because they are able to move on further, and of course the Germans can't. They don't really have the oil supply, so they can't really start making that change in transition. Whereas Britain can get oil from Canada, America, and from the Persian Gulf.
And since we touched the gun accuracy, there was also, I believe, one more thing that kind of hindered the British accuracy. It was the mix-up with the fire distribution on the ships that we mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Because since Tiger and Lion were both firing on the same ship and didn't know about it, Tiger was kind of mistaking the Lion's shell splashes for their own, so was consistently missing for a long time because basically they had their range set wrong.
Yeah, they were shooting about 3,000 yards long, but they didn't realize it.
I guess this might have been also the motivation in the interwar period for many navies moving to the colored shells, right?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. The dyed shells at least tells you which ship is shooting, which shells are exploding. Which, I mean, the fact there's also a lot fewer capital ships means it's you can do that without duplicating colors. But yeah, I mean, it's partly that, and to be honest, it's also just partly, as we said, shoddy leadership in terms of not making his instructions clear before the battle when he had plenty of time. And then not correcting when you'd hope he'd notice that there's an awful lot of shell splashes around one ship and none around the next.
The one thing you can blame on Beatty is that he really wasn't the new Nelson, because the one thing Nelson was absolutely excellent at was making sure his subordinates had an idea of what he was going to do before he did it. So they could interpret his commands and would know what his intentions were. Beatty seems to... Well, he has a lot of social opportunities with his officers. He's always wanting to have a party and have them over for socializations, but doesn't seem to use those occasions for actually doing anything of his job.
I would say great tradition of the Royal Navy, though, right? Entertaining on the ship.
Yeah, but I would say Beatty's command style is what I would call, if for those 40k fans out there, he's a very erudite and well-spoken orc.
Mm-hmm.
He was very, very polite, very well spoken. He'll hold a brilliant party, but his to be honest, he probably would have been a lot clearer in battle if he just hoisted a massive red flag with "Wah" on it and charged off. At least then everyone would have had a vague idea what the heck he wanted them to do.
So this is a question from my side. Before we go to the next question, why they had radios on those ships, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
They tend to get shot.
But I mean, like, why would you not use your radio to like give a command? Like, signal flags seem like a very archaic method. If you have a radio that you can use to radio the other ship to tell it what the hell you want it to do,
it's
okay.
It's partly the fact that they still want your orders to be relatively secret, because at the kind of ranges you're talking about shooting over, the chances of the enemy reading your flag signals are pretty much slim to none. So there's a certain amount of element of surprise there, and you can pre-arrange this signal, this particular combination of flags in this context means this, and that's not going to be interpretable by anybody else. The other thing is that because of where the bridge is and where the flag officer is and where the flag yardarms are, if the officer on the bridge says do this, then the flags can be run up pretty quickly. Everyone can see them. Everyone can acknowledge them visually, so he knows the orders have been received. At least, hopefully, he's checking for that, and then the order can be executed. If you transmit via radio, the radio transmitting stations are nowhere near the bridge, so you would have to give your order. Someone would have to run that order down to the radio transmitting station, hope that he doesn't get killed by shell fragments on the way. The radio transmitter guy, assuming the radio transmitters are working, now has to send it out to the fleet. He has to hope it's not being jammed. He has to hope that the aerials haven't been cut. And in theory, you again, to make sure the enemy doesn't know what you're doing before your fleet does, you have to probably encode it. Then the guys on all the other ships, they have to decode it, and assuming they've received it, and send it back up to the bridge. It's a time lag.
So given the technology, it's just faster. Okay.
Yeah.
And also with radios, you have to remember the damage we were talking about, especially in this period, but even in World War II. You're not talking about the fire from the enemy and the enemy shells hitting your ship causing damage to the radios, although they can certainly take out the wires and all the things you need for transmitting. No, the actual components can be shaken apart by the firing of your own guns.
Okay, look, this makes a lot of sense. And then finally, why not use Morse code?
Why not use what? Oh, Morse
code.
Oh, signal. You mean
signal
by
lights.
flashing it by signal lights? You can do that. They try that. They do. Obviously, they have to do that at night because you can't see the flags. But during the daylight, it's relatively difficult to see the signal lights. You can get gun smoke in the way, which can cut out half the message, etc. And again, they can also get smashed.
Well, thank you for explaining this for me, Mr. Conway. Never been in the Navy? No, I've been on a boat. Multiple. I've been on multiple boats, even 1 or 2 ships, even on 1 or 2 warships. I've even, my proudest World of Warships achievement, I've even got to fire the B gun on HMS
Cavalier.
Oh,
Yes.
very nice.
Well, with a very small blank, but it's still fun. Okay, let's go for the next.
I think you skipped.
We did, yes, we did. Question. We are at question 5 of 15. By the way, we're going to have to speed up a bit, gentlemen. So Yamato 8125 is asking, why did the admiral think that the signal book didn't need revision due to the fact that some of the errors on the battle of the British side were due to miscommunication? And what was the real reason for the Admiralty not putting teams of decryption section on the ship to receive the messages of the location of the German fleet?
Do you want to take that one, Dr. Clarke?
Yeah, go on. For the starters, why did they? It wasn't really the fault of the Admiralty, code book and the Admiralty's flag book that there was miscommunication. It was the fault of the person using it. So you can't really blame a hammer because you hit your own thumb with it. And changing the hammer isn't necessarily going to make you less likely to hit your own thumb. As for the other one, and I'm just going to remind myself of the second part of the question, and what was the real reason for the Admiralty not putting teams in the description section? Well, it's quite simple. Again, it goes back to that control of information. If you put a decryption team on your ship, you're going to reveal you're doing decryption because it's going to be known to far more people. A office of random mathematicians and crossword enthusiasts, etc., sitting in the middle of the Admiralty is nothing that anyone's going to take any notice of. It's just another bureaucratic office. No one's going to notice. A sudden cell of these people appearing in the middle of the Grand Fleet or the battlecruiser force on the flagship is a group that people are going to notice.
And what if they get shot?
Well, that matters less because you probably won't put your best ones there. If you do, then it's really silly.
Yeah, but you've got to bear in mind
it is annoying.
There is information cross-flow even between the Grand Fleet and the High Seas Fleet in the middle of World War One, because people are still having parties, still entertaining naval attachés from neutral countries like Sweden. And of course, the Swedish naval attachés talk to each other, and then you might have information that's given to the Swedish attaché in Britain. He talks to the Swedish Admiralty. They talk to the Swedish attaché in Berlin, who then talks to German officers. And suddenly stuff that was said in Scapa Flow ends up in Wilhelmshaven and vice versa. That's actually how the British found out that their shells were defective. Because the Germans had a party where they had a really good laugh with some neutral naval attachés saying, the British shells are completely and utterly useless. This is absolutely hilarious. Wouldn't it be funny if they knew? And those attachés immediately went off like, by the way, did you know? And a few months later at a party, Jellicoe and Beatty are entertaining, I think it was the Swedish naval attaché, who's like, did you know, by the way, your shells don't work? The Germans said so.
Predictably, Beatty and Jellicoe, well, particularly Jellicoe, were then seen orbiting the Earth at a very high speed after exiting through the roof of the building.
Yeah. But politely, because appearances must be kept, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
it was I'm so that you do say.
I'm just.
I need to quickly go outside to smoke. Jellicoe, you don't smoke. I'm going with Beatty, who does.
Okay, let's head over to the next question, which is from Chieftain, or Chieftain, I'm not sure. After the misinterpretation of Beatty's signals when HMS Lion was crippled, do you think it was fortunate that the battlecruisers stopped pursuing the Germans and focused on Blücher? Was the magazine handling on the battlecruisers as slack as at Jutland?
On the second part, no. It's partly this battle that results in that, because they really, really want to fire quicker.
Because of Chatfield.
Yes. The what could have happened if the battle cruisers continued their pursuit is a huge what if, and it's one that's very difficult to call, because you would have had New Zealand, Princess Royal, and Tiger's already been hit pretty hard, versus Seydlitz, which obviously also been hit very hard, but Moltke and Der Flinger, which, if Tiger had been completely intact, I'd give a slight advantage on that to the British. With Tiger being as it was, and Der Flinger being fully intact, it would be a very close match to call. It would probably come down to who hits who first, heavily, and again, that's a bit up in the air, because the Germans would probably score more hits, but because of their lighter shells, they would probably need more hits to try and find a vital spot, whereas it would, as with Seydlitz, it would only take one heavy British shell landing in the right place to really mess something up. So it could go either way. You can I'd say probably yes, for both sides, it was fortunate the battle broke off where it did, because whatever happened, if those 3 British battle cruisers had continued chasing the 3 Germans, you almost certainly would have resulted in at least one more ship going down with heavy casualties.
You'd also probably have...
don't know, but it saved several thousand people's lives.
You'd have also probably had the British light forces divide, in that good enough light cruisers would have probably stayed with the battle cruisers hanging back, i.e. Beatty, to protect them, and Twit would have led his Harwich force, his 3 light cruisers and his destroyers forward again to sort of keep up with the advancing ships. So you might have conceivably ended up with that sort of destroyer versus destroyer scenario, especially if there's another German ship damaged and they're slowed down. For the Germans, the big problem isn't necessarily the British getting a kill shot, it's the British getting a shot which slows them down. If it's a shot which kills a ship, then it blows up. It's you've lost a lot of people. That's bad. That's not good. But you don't have to slow down. If you have shots which actually slow down, and remember, in the stern chase, you could end up losing your rudder. You could end up having damage to your propellers. All these things could be done, because those compartments are especially usually less protected. You then have a problem in that you can't run away. Do you protect the ship? Do you stay with it? Or do you leave it? Either way, you could lose that ship, and either way, the light forces could get involved with the British.
As they actually did with the Blücher, right? Because she was finished by torpedoes from a light cruiser, I believe.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and Hipper was not a happy man when he had to leave Blücher behind. But at that point, the only reason he pretty much left it behind was because people persuaded him that of all the German large ships to be lost, it was the least valuable. If it had been Der Flinger that had taken that bad hit, or if that fire on Seydlitz had spread, he would have been a much, much more difficult person to persuade to leave one of those behind.
And that could have been a very, very different battle, because, again, if you have a close-in engagement like that, well, whilst Beatty would certainly hang off with his light cruisers and probably do a firing, and the High Seas Fleet would probably be trying to move up to try and get closer, or whatever support they can get would try and move up closer, it would probably be quickly decided by the light forces, because if you've got big ships like that who are either slowed down or who are tied to place, that's when the light forces, especially if they can use some smoke screens and creative work and aggressively handled, can really come into play with their torpedoes. Because, again, as you know, as everyone who plays World of Warships knows, if your enemy is stationary, firing torpedoes is great. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah. I think actually we answered kind of the next 2 questions from Killerbrain34 and Yogi Khan already during discussion of earlier questions, because yes, this is the signals question, and this is
the question from Yogi Khan. What actions could Admiral Beatty have done better to make the battle a decisive victory and not a minor victory? I think we've already talked about this.
I think the clearest answer here was...
I could answer that in one sentence.
I
can answer that in one sentence. Okay. Resign and put Twits in charge.
And if you must insist on him being in charge in the battle, the single best thing he could have done is shut up and let someone else take over when Lion got crippled.
Yes.
We're really hating on BT.
Yes.
I dig it.
Well, I think deservedly, but
Yes. Okay. So let's go straight to the next one, which is from Admiral Fox 08, who's asking, how do you think the outcome would have changed if the other German battlecruisers, von der Tann, Göben? Okay, we're gonna practice this together, right? By the way, is it Lützow or Lutzow? I think it's Lützow, right? So it should be von der Tann, Göben, Lützow, and Hindenburg.
We're there.
we're there. What if
We're
we
there.
switch Ingenohl
What if
for
we switch
share?
Ingenohl for share and the battleships don't run away?
Well,
I
then the
don't think the
Germans
ba-
have like 2-1 advantage, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, with the latter part, I don't think the battle actually, although
wouldn't
it
have
ran
taken
for quite
place,
a while
right?
and ran over a fair distance, it didn't run quite far enough for them to have reached the High Seas Fleet. So although the High Seas Fleet would have been a lot closer, I don't, much like the Grand Fleet, I think it would have been just a bit too far away.
And
If the battle
I
had,
think-
had run the course
But-
that it historically did. But if you bring those other 4 battle cruisers in, you've now gone from, as we said, 3.5 versus 5. You've now got what, 7.5 versus 5, and of those, 2 of them are Der Flinger class. And Hindenburg, in the wonderful German tradition of building any class that's greater than 2, and sometimes even with classes that are only 2 ships, made significant modifications. Hindenburg is almost effectively a subclass compared to Der Flinger. So, yeah, bring those in, and I don't want one.
Shades of the
Hipper's not running
Panzerschiffe.
away.
Also, bring those in, and honestly, if they're available, then I doubt the British turn up with just 5. I think if the British think there's that many battle cruisers in availability, there are going to be more of the British battle cruisers there.
But even if they,
Yes.
so
you know.
even if they had turned up with that initially, I mean, the British ships were faster, right? So they could have just turned tail, kited away until reinforcements arrived.
Possibly. The only reservation I'd have about that would be the 3 Der Flingers are pretty nippy, and some of the Invincibles and Indefatigables aren't, like Indomitable. So if the British had turned tail and run, you could very well have had pretty much the situation we had historically with Blucher, but in reverse, where the Der Flingers might have been able to pull ahead of the rest of the German ships a bit, and some of the Invincibles would have been falling behind a bit. And I mean, okay, the Indefatigables are actually worse armored than the Invincibles, but neither of them are particularly well protected. And yeah, you could have seen 1 or 2 of the Invincibles crippled, knocked out, and then Beatty having to make the decision that Hipper historically had to.
And as old Richard points out on YouTube, Lützow was working up and Hindi was still on the stocks.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes,
Well, we're assuming they've been magically completed and transported in. So
And what
I mean,
you have to
Goebin's
remember-
in the Black Sea. So
And what you have to remember, what actually does exist and isn't that far away at this point, is Queen Elizabeth. So you'd have to imagine that if the Royal Navy had the inkling that the High Seas Fleet's battlecruiser force was going to come out with this, the scouting group was going to come out with this kind of strength, you have to imagine Queen Elizabeth would have been there, possibly Warspite, which does commission in March 1915 from memory, would have found herself rapidly commissioned, and so you could have had them along, because they could have certainly kept up with the Invincibles, and then that of course would turn, yes, you've got a slower wing, but that slower wing has those 2 in it. Good luck to your battle cruisers.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move swiftly on.
Dryalga.
Dryalga, yes. The Battle of Dogger Bank took place not too far from the shores of the Netherlands and Denmark, which were both neutral during World War I. Were there any guidelines by either the Royal Navy or the Kaiserliche Marine regarding surface operations near the coast of neutral nations during World War I? And was there any reaction by either the Dutch Navy or the Danish Navy whenever naval action took place near their respective coasts?
Well, they used to like to try and keep an eye on it, but basically they mainly kept out the way. And the rule was, if you are going to violate their sovereignty, don't get caught.
Yeah,
that's a good
We
rule.
don't want to have to try and explain it.
yeah, it was basically by remaining neutral and enforcing their neutrality, the Dutch and Danish coasts would actually work for both sides equally. What both fleets, both nations were looking for was to see the minute those nations allowed that neutrality to slip slightly, because if they start allowing one side or the other ships to pass through their waters, then the other side's going to be like, right, we're going in, we're just going to ignore this. So I think both governments for Denmark and the Netherlands were very conscious of that, and the last thing they wanted was massive naval battles taking place right off their coast, because they knew their own navies wouldn't stand a chance of putting themselves between the two. And it's not going to do good things for their own coastal shipping or their own reputation as neutral nations. So it was it was a standoff where both Germany and Britain were looking at them and going, as long as you make sure the other guy stays out, we'll leave you alone. And as a result, everyone was kind of hands off and stay away, because they didn't want to compromise it in a way that would allow the other side to take advantage of that.
It's kind of interesting because earlier today, me and Drac were actually having a conversation about the Dutch Navy and how they were unlucky because they almost had battleships prior to World War One. And it's the thing is, they would have really liked to have been some battleships to enforce their neutrality in World War One, but they of course don't build them because of World.
You can basically check out the opposite example in World War II, when basically the entire kerfuffle of Norway came to such big scale, because basically there was a plan by the Royal Navy to mine the Norwegian waters when the German Navy was sailing to actually invade Norway. So that was kind of a meeting engagement that came from both sides, basically pushing the...
They want both pushing the envelope, yeah.
With that one, you have to sort of go back and you're basically going, right then, when do you both start planning for Norway operations? And the Germans technically do beat the British first in officially planning, because their official planning date starts about a month prior to the British. But both were planning for Norway operations long before World War II actually happened.
Yep. That's...
Okay.
Poor Norway.
On to the next one, which is from not here. Had naval warfare tactics progressed much from naval warfare in the 19th century by this time?
It depends what part of the 19th century, because the 19th century includes the Battle of Trafalgar and the Spanish-American War and everything in between. But obviously, from age of sail tactics, yes, obviously it has progressed quite considerably. As far as the tail end of the 19th century is concerned, as you're looking at things like not really the first Sino-Japanese War, the first modern Sino-Japanese War, and the Spanish-American War, most of the tactics outside of the use of submarines and torpedoes that you see in the First World War are already being employed in those conflicts. The main difference is range, because in both of those conflicts it's being fought at 500, 800 yards. A few of the battles in the Spanish-American War, they try and open fire at the mighty range of 1,000 to 1,500 yards and basically hit nothing. So they close the range down. And it's as you turn from the 19th to the 20th century that you get rangefinders and direct-to-fire control, and the range of engagement suddenly steps up massively from effectively just outside Nelsonian ranges through to what we see in World War One, which is 15,000, 20,000 yards. And it's a hugely rapid innovation. This is partly why the Germans have this range disadvantage, because at the time that they're actually building most of these ships in the late 1900s, early 1910s, they actually are looking at a situation where everyone's thinking the range is going to be at 10,000, 12,000 yards. So they build their ships for that. And just so happens that 4 years later, the ranges have extended to a point where that's no longer really a viable thing. The French are even worse.
Yeah, whoever gets to shoot first has first draw, right?
Yeah,
okay.
I always like to point out the Corbett's, the French dreadnoughts, their secondary battery outranges their primary battery.
that's
purely because of elevation issues.
weird.
Hmm.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Ace of Bears would like to know, were there any lessons that ought to have been learned at Dogger Bank but weren't? I think we touched
that,
on this extensively already. Next one from Saxo75. The usual story about the Battle of Dogger Bank is that Hipper could not escape from the Royal Navy battlecruisers because Blücher was too slow. But was Hipper's actual problem not his destroyers, who could not maintain the necessary speed due to the weather and the bad coal they had to use?
Not really, because the destroyers are not the primary target. Obviously, the capital ships are. If it had got to an absolutely desperate situation, Hipper could have ordered his destroyers to go off at some odd angle somewhere. Probably not north, because you would have run into First Light Cruiser Squadron, but he could have ordered them to motor off in a different direction, and that would have been fine. They had the two problems, which was overall the bad coal, which we've discussed, and also the fact that Blücher was not designed with the incredibly high speeds for the time of battle cruisers in mind. She was designed as the next generation of armored cruiser, which is slower. She just physically was not going to be able to outrun the British, whatever happened. Once she's gone, the other German ships are a knot or two quicker overall, which helps them pull away the range as well. But with the bad coal problems that they had, they were always going to be at a disadvantage especially if the Lion, Princess Royal, and Tiger decided to make a run of it, if they were prepared to let New Zealand an indomitable lag.
Okay.
And just to answer that one, I'm just going to apologise. I ran off to grab a book because I was looking everywhere for it, and then I realised that, and viewers of my channel will know this happens a lot, it had been borrowed by one of the other members of my family, namely my mum, who likes to nick all my books. This is the one joy of living at home to try and save money to buy your place in London.
You hold it up for everyone?
It is called the Kaiser's U-boat assault on America. And actually, this is the one big sort of thing which I always like to bring up when I start talking about the tactics. And I start discussing the sort of tactics of World War I versus, the 19th century. Is that actually quite a lot of the tactics of the early 19th century come back again. It's almost a case of it becomes crossing the T again, and it becomes long-range raiding and all these operations. They had presumed at the end of the age of sail that the whole sort of cruisers, the frigates going around the world doing commerce raiding was over. And this is one of the reasons why the Royal Navy takes so long to adopt the convoys again, because they got out of the mindset of convoys because everyone thought the technology had evolved past the point at which you need it. But actually, the whole thing had sort of evolved in that you had submarines doing some of the taking on some of these frigate operations, these commerce interdiction, and you had, of course, cruisers, if they were available, actually doing it themselves as well at longer ranges and surface raiders. And it's one of those interesting things. But it also features into this sort of question about the destroyers and whether they slowed down Hipper's force. They didn't actually slow down the force. One of the things you find about the German destroyers is they are very, very good at keeping up with their ships. And one of the reasons they can do this is because they need a lot less coal than the battle cruisers and capital ships, and often the commanders of the destroyers are far more, how do I put this, realizing that speed really does, that their lives really do depend on speed, manage to try and get the better quality coal that they can, because as good a quality, you might not have enough that you can fill up an entire battle cruiser with the good quality coal, so you have to keep it consistent. You go with the best coal you can available. You can often get enough to fill up a destroyer, or at least mix into a destroyer's coal to give it a slightly better burn.
Okay. There was a comment there from Vice Admiral Laffey, and he actually said, he says, as I recall, they also lost a Hawkins-class cruiser to grounding. It ran over a rock that was marked on the map, but covered by a navigator's pencil.
Yes,
that was after the war. Yeah.
This was related to the ongoing discussion about the Norwegian campaign that's
okay. I just wanted to point this out
chat on Twitch.
Okay, fine. Okay, so let's head off to the next one. P-38 Lightning. How long could the ships of the day operate at seas without having to return to port for fuel and supplies? And were ships ever resupplied at sea? I mean, probably not in the channel, but...
It depends entirely on the ship. A battle cruiser, if it's motoring along at cruising speed, can be at sea for weeks, quite happily. A destroyer is, at best, going to be at sea for a few days. And the amount of fuel that you expend when you're really motoring like this at Dogger Bank, it goes up dramatically. Yes, you're going to cover more distance, but you're going to burn through your fuel stocks far quicker. So by the time you've done a big high-speed engagement like this, you're going to be wanting to head back for home pretty sharpish. The main restriction on all of these ships is their fuel supplies. You can carry an awful lot more food for your crew than you can coal, and coaling is difficult enough on land. Coaling at sea could be done, but unless you absolutely had to do it, it was a very good way to start people muttering about mutiny.
It also gets coal dust everywhere, so it's not just the thing of actually loading the coal. You then have to clean the ship down to keep it working, and the coal dust will get everywhere. So if you have very precise instruments, I don't know, like range finders or guns or all the equipment you actually have on a ship at the time, it's going to get caked. So you're basically going to take everything apart, especially at sea where the ship is moving. So that's going to disturb the dust even more.
At least it's not coarse and rough, even if it does get it.
But it's definitely irritating.
Yes.
Very irritating, yes.
Okay, let's move on to the last question. And we've got a bonus question that was more of an essay. That's why it didn't fit in the overlay. No LBP. The Germans knew that air power on land was very important, but I would like to know more about the naval versus land-based air wing discussions or any conflicts between the leaders on why there wasn't more emphasis on naval air power early on in World War I. And if possible, World War II, why the aircraft carriers were not evolved and used. Okay. Also, on the side note, he just wants to thank Drachinifel for all his awesome videos. He's been a subscriber for some time and looks forward to your hard work every day. Thank you. By the way, I have to point out, for all of you that left questions, some of them included like nice intros or thank yous or a little of shout outs to our guests. Unfortunately, they usually get cut in the process of putting them on the channel. But since our guests all have access to the questions, they will have read them. Just pointing this out.
Yeah, we do read all the questions and all the nice thank yous. So, air power. Part of it is, let's face it, air power in 1914 is an incredibly primitive thing. People are somewhat nervous about taking off on aircraft that are flying over land, which is a place that you can put down if something goes wrong. Asking someone in a circa 1914 era aircraft, would you like to go flying out over the cold, dark wastes of the North Sea for several hours?
And then land on a ship.
Yeah, it's just going to be, how about you do that? And I stay here in the nice warm land. They're also incredibly fragile things. And like a North, I think this is one of the best ways of describing the difference. If you have a North Sea storm in World War II, and you have an aircraft you're using for maritime reconnaissance, it can probably either fly above the storm, or worst case scenario, it's probably got a reasonable chance of surviving flying through the storm. If you're in a canvas and wood contraption in 1914, you're not flying over that storm, and if you fly through it, assuming you don't get hit by lightning and burnt to a crisp in your open cockpit, it'll tear your wings off like a mayfly, and you will be a very soggy pile of wreckage in the North Sea very quickly. The one variant on that was the Zeppelins, and the German Navy did go in quite heavily on Zeppelin reconnaissance. They're very long range, they have the endurance that early aircraft lack, and they are somewhat more durable, and they can actually, quite surprisingly, fly higher than a lot of aircraft in the early part of the First World War. Their only disadvantage is because they are so huge, it kind of like an old sailing ship. If the wind is against them, they ain't going anywhere.
And the Royal Navy has quite a few of the airships as well. And it's the one part of naval aviation which often gets overlooked, but it was a really major thing in 1914, 1915.
If you're
I
in a
think
Zeppelin
it's-
and the weather is bad, you can either end up being blown over the enemy coast, which is bad, or you might end up just sitting there motoring along quite happily for hours, burn all your fuel, and discover you've gone about 3 miles.
I think the British airships are overlooked because they just don't have the catchy name. Like, I mean, you have Zeppelin, you have airship.
Yeah.
By the way, before we get to the essay, actually,
It's branding.
It's what?
Yeah. It's branding,
It's
yes,
branding,
exactly.
Yeah.
Before we get to the essay, to the long question, I just noticed one question we didn't include in the numbered ones, but since we were already touching the hypotheticals, it's from Tiernan 17. If the commanders of the British and German forces switched places, i.e. BT commanding the 1st Scouting Group and Hipper commanding the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron, how would the battle progress differently if it would happen at all?
Hipper would have won.
Yes.
Yes.
Quite-
Hipper
quite
would have
decisive.
whipped BT something chronic.
Let's put it this way: Hipper won at Jutland when he was outnumbered and outgunned. That is really not open to question. If you give Hipper the firepower advantage, the speed advantage, and then set him on a course where he's going to run headlong into an enemy fleet that's commanded by someone like BT,
Who doesn't
Hipper-
have those things?
yeah, Hipper's going to walk away with that so hard it's not even going to be funny. And to cap it all off, BT would probably hoist some hilariously spaghetti-like signal that would probably send his ships going off in 4 different directions at once. At which point Hipper would just be like, "Well, who shall we kill first today?" Yeah. But to be honest, the only reason Hipper doesn't get more credit and fame than he does, and I think he does deserve an awful lot of recognition because he was an exceptionally good admiral. Is he just had the slight misfortune to end up sailing in the German Navy? If Hipper had switched places at birth with BT, he would legitimately have been called the new Nelson, and for very good reason.
Either Hipper or Von Spey. Von Spey would also have been a very, very good admiral the Royal Navy would have liked to have had. And honestly, I think Von Spey is probably the biggest loss to the Germans at the beginning of World War One. Losing him at the Battle of Falklands, you lose one of the person who'd be handpicked as, in many ways, by not just Tirpitz but by most naval staff as the best naval officer you have of your generation as a vice admiral. If you have Von Spey back in charge of the German fleet for World War One, there are all sorts of things which might have happened to Beatty, especially. Jellicoe, he could have probably contended with him. Beatty, that would have been not fair.
Okay, let's head over to our last question of the day. It is our slide essay. So there's many parts of this question. Look, I'm just going to look, guys, we love you. Next time, do me a favor. Submit 3 separate questions. Makes it easier.
Yes.
So it's from Kaufmania, and he says, I know we're going to talk BT. So let's talk BT and his skills or lack thereof at fleet command and some moose.
Why moose?
I don't know. I think it would have been pretty clear to both BT and Hipper that for the first couple of hours of the engagement and closing stern chase that the Deutsche Schwadron was becoming excellent wreck dives in the shallow waters of Dogger Bank. Until, of course, BT stumbles up on his flag signaling, inadvertently sending his 4 undamaged battlecruisers to pummel the poor helpless Blücher. He says, poor form, old chap. Hey, at least BT was signaling something this time. My questions are, first, is the raising of the 45 degrees northeast signal and engage enemy rear at the same time a function of A, BT's incompetency either as a command officer or because he had made the switch from 90 northeast to 45 northeast when he confused an out-of-fuel surfacing torpedo for a periscope? Apparently, BT didn't stay informed much on current naval technologies either. Or Rear Admiral Moose confusion of the 2 signals. This is elaborated more in my second question below. Or the fact that the electrical power had been knocked out on HMS Lion and this was an honest mistake.
Why not all 3?
Let's do the first.
It's a factor of all 3. It is, let's be honest, it is a factor of all 3, but honestly, and actually, I'm so tempted to now call him Rear Admiral Moose from now on, but he's Rear Admiral Moore, but Moose is an improvement. Moore should have actually just assumed command. Again, this is the factor is, if you consider the standing orders that Jellicoe has and various other admirals in the Royal Navy and also have for their second in command, basically it is a case of if my ship's knocked out, you're to take command until I can take command back. It's not a I will tell you have command. It's a you will take command, because command will always be maintained. That's one thing which the Royal Navy is obsessed with, and it's an interesting thing in the Battlecruiser Force that Maud doesn't. Beatty's incompetence, he's probably giving out the commands separately, but then he has the flag officer he does have, and he has a flag captain. Well, you see, again, this is the thing. When Beatty has a decent flag captain, the flag captain tends to make sure his other the other officers around him either know what they're doing or are managed as well. And therefore, these things don't happen. It's one of the interesting things when Beatty's in charge of the Grand Fleet. He has a different flag captain, as we bring over, the Brook, and he does far better. So it's a combination of all three, but really you have to go with Beatty not paying attention to what his officers are doing. That's the thing. Beatty's up in his head doing something, probably thinking he's riding a horse while defeating Hipper or something like that. He's not actually in the battle. This is the trouble with BT. His brain isn't present in the battle. He's giving orders. He's got all these ideas. He's not actually present going, what actually has happened? Yes, I've given that order, but is it being actually followed through? Do they know what I'm telling them?
Yeah, and
because again...
Stuff like what with that confusion of signals, that's basic flag signaling etiquette. If you hoist a couple of signals on different yardarms simultaneously, that means they're meant to be interpreted as the same order relating to the same subject. It's not rocket science. That's something that would have gotten like a 16-year-old cadet wrapped over the knuckles at Dartmouth for mixing up.
It's something which even a midshipman in service would have.
Yeah, those are orders that need to go up one after the other, not so sequentially, not concurrently. And the fact they go up concurrently is just it's just an abysmal failure of Seymour for actually doing it in the first place, and for Beatty for not spotting it. Because let's face it, these are signal flags that are designed to be interpreted by ships that are several miles away. They're flying off his yardarms, like 10, 12, 15 yards away. They're not difficult to spot. If you're being...
there are two officers who have the role who could have corrected Seymour at this point. There is Beatty and there is Chatfield, his flag captain. So we've already accepted that Seymour, frankly, shouldn't have been in the post, and I'm still not quite sure how he passed the basic entry exams. I'm fairly sure large amounts of alcohol and various other things have to be involved. But Chatfield theoretically has 20-something years experience in the Navy at this point, is a captain of a flagship. He should be watching his flags and taking command, as well as being able to command his ship. He's on the bridge, which is not that far away. You've got Beatty. You have got all sorts of executive officers, commanders, etc. going around. There are lots of officers who should have noticed, hang on, that's gone up at the same time as that. What the are you on? Because you could have pulled them down and changed the instructions.
Yeah.
Yes, it would have caused a quick confusion, but it would have been corrected.
And there are plenty of examples in numerous battles of decent flag officers who, when their ship has been disabled, either if they remain with the disabled ship or if they're off on a smaller ship looking for a new flagship, they're sensible enough to go, right, my ship is disabled, my ship is out of line, I do not have the complete picture, I'm going to let my subordinates take over. We see this even at things like Midway, the Battle of Midway in World War II. Once Yorktown gets badly knocked about, Admiral Fletcher doesn't stay there on Yorktown trying to tell everybody what to do. He lets his subordinates take over and do their thing, and
also gives freedom to Spruance to basically act as he will. Because...
Yeah, and even the people who are present at this battle at Jutland, once it's very clear to Hipper that Lutzow is going down, he finds a destroyer and then has the merry job of trying to find another German battlecruiser that's vaguely intact in the middle of the night, but he allows his subordinates to continue to follow Shear's orders, and the battle cruisers do a number of fairly complex and dangerous things whilst Hipper is no longer in command. But they pull those things off because A, Hipper's got subordinates who are good at their job and he trusts, and B, he's not dumb enough to try and take command of a situation for a dinky little destroyer when he doesn't even have any idea where half of his ships are. Whereas if that situation had been reversed, you can guarantee Beatty would have been charging around in the darkness, flashing signal lights left, right, and centre, saying, look at me, I'm in charge, do what I say.
There is actually a very valid game-related comment from The Real Idakman on Twitch. Beatty as a special captain automatically spams F keys. I think that fits.
I think that would be glorious, yes, but also
Yes.
very annoying. So let's we'll quickly return to this essay of a question. Look, I think part 2 is more of the same. He's asking about why Rear Admiral Moose, it's also better this way, didn't just ignore BT, and he says go full Horatio Nelson sailing right at the buggers. But I think we talked about that at length.
Yeah.
And then
Basically, Trit would have done that, Nor wouldn't. So Trit, if he'd had a chance, yes, that would have been happening. In fact, as I said, if Trit had been done, it would have been a very different scenario. If he'd been second in command or even in command. So it's one of those scenarios. You have good enough, you have Trit, you have these two very good naval officers who are very good commanders. Actually, and they're in positions 3 and 4 in the ranks out actually fighting this battle. And you're sitting there going, if I could put you two in charge, it would be a very different contest Hipper would have been facing.
Okay. And to get to part 3 of his question, which he labeled as part 2 again, I'm just going to niggle a little bit here because I can't niggle about the content. I'm just going to read it out. How do you think the fact that Sie Deutsch getting away affected BT afterwards? As pompous and arrogant of a man as that he was, I'm sure the fact that a total devastating victory over Hipper's forces slipped through his fingers must have infuriated him. No iron-bottom banks for you, BT. Could this be a motivation for his actions at Jutland? Could his actions at Jutland be reinterpreted as Nelsonian at heart, but not mind? Or was he always fucking shit up like this?
Drac, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, as I said, Beatty is a good commander of gunboats. He's not a good commander of ships, fleets, etc. As we've said before, his response to all of this at Dogger Bank, when he realizes that most of the first scouting group has slipped away, is clearly the answer. Not that we need to hit more accurately. It's like, no, we've thrown hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of shells at the Germans, and only a few of them have hit. Clearly, the solution is we need to throw several hundred more shells at the Germans, because eventually, if we blow up enough of those grid coordinates, something will hit them. Rather completely ignoring the fact that the Germans had faced exactly the same problems of range as he did and got considerably better results out of it. So, yeah, he really didn't take... as much as he took any lessons from Dogger Bank, he took the wrong ones. And he doesn't seem particularly willing to learn even those. Classic case, you probably know, you've probably run into a few people like this, listeners as well, over your various careers. He tried to blame everyone but himself. He was kind of initially he was blaming Moore, he was blaming Pelly, he was blaming literally everybody else on all the other battle cruisers. Oh, you should have known I meant you to do this. And everyone's like, well, we didn't know what on earth you intended to do, period, let alone when you told us via signal to do a very specific thing. And now you're saying you didn't want us to do that thing. It's not a good position to be in.
And it gets worse when you consider that eventually, of course, BT does come round to the idea of, yes, I need to work on the accuracy of my fleet. Yes, we need to work on the accuracy. Yes, we need to do these things. But he only comes around to that opinion when he thinks he can use it to get himself a hold of 5th Battle Squadron with, of course, the Queen Elizabeth class battleships so that he can get them in the battlecruiser force, because that's his other idea. He thinks if he has them, he can basically take on anything, and they won't be. And the German scouting group we wiped out, and he'll be able to win a battle. And probably in his mind, he imagines him taking the combined force, freed from the Invincibles. So having these sort of ultra modern super dreadnoughts. In his mind, backing him up, he will take on the whole high seas fleet, beat it, and show the world that he is amazing. And I honestly, yeah,
to underscore how little BT learned, even in terms of the most basic communication skills at this point. When he's preparing for the Battle of Jutland and he has 5th Battle Squadron, he never talks to Admiral Evan Thomas between the Queen Elizabeth's arriving at the Firth of Forth and sailing for Jutland. So Evan Thomas goes into Jutland not knowing a single, literally having not spoken to the person who's supposedly in charge of him, and not having any idea what BT wants him to do. And that's after Dogger Bank, where BT should have learned that perhaps talking to your subordinates in advance is occasionally useful.
Wait, do you mean the telepathy doesn't work?
They were literally, their ships were moored a couple of 100 yards, 300 yards away from each other. Mm-hmm. It would be like a couple of minutes to get there. It's not a long trip for either way. And BT loves to have a party. Invite him over for a party. Have the discussion. I do sometimes worry that I spend quite a lot of my life bashing BT. And as Drac will know, I don't like bash people for just being in the past, to just keep using hindsight. But BT is someone who doesn't learn even when he has hindsight.
Maybe he was jealous of the larger caliber.
Could be. No, to be honest, once he gets command of the, I think that, again, this underlines the difference between the two men. Jellicoe, until he detaches them, has 5th Battle Squadron for quite some time in the Grand Fleet. He also has a number of the R-class, also armed with 15-inch guns. He keeps his flagship on Iron Duke. It's the flagship he took over when he started command of the Grand Fleet, and he sees no particular reason to change it just because another ship has a slightly bigger broadside. The minute BT gets into command, he shifts his flag from Iron Duke to Queen Elizabeth. So yeah, he literally was jealous that the other ship had the bigger guns.
Probably, maybe also since she was newer, she had better accommodations.
Less rats?
Not really. Iron Duke by that time has been turned into a solid flagship.
Yeah, and she was the lead ship of her class, so she was designed with flagship accommodations in there as well. So,
by the way, speaking of the flag accommodations, I had a question that I wanted to look up and forgot, but maybe you two gentlemen know. Basically, was already in the Royal Navy and the First World War, was there a practice of having a ship bridge and flag bridge separated, or was Admiral still looking over the shoulder of his flag captain? And
they were separate. They have let's put it this way, they often do actually co-locate, especially in the role of flag captain, but theoretically they have separate bridges and they're sort of separate. But again, they wander up. It's literally, if I remember correctly, usually the Admiral's bridge is the deck below the captain's bridge, usually. Because whilst the Admiral does need a good view, he doesn't need as good a view as the captain, because he's supposed to be listening to everyone else. But tends to be the Admiral does wander up, and in BT's case, he likes to wander up to the captain's thing to interfere in Chatfield quite a lot. This also caused another problem for the command of his fleet, because again, you have spaces on a flag admiral's on an admiral's sort of bridge that you don't have on a ship's bridge. You have positions. If you start having your staff officers come in there, you're going to interfere with the operation of the ship, but you're also going to interfere with the operations of the staff because they're competing for the same space.
Yeah, that's actually why I asked, because I admit I never realized the importance of this until reading the Shattered Sword and actually the description of what environment Nagumo and his staff had to work on, like on a tiny little bridge where all the ship's operations were going on at the same time. So that's why I thought that I will ask.
Yeah, you've also got to remember a lot of these ships, especially the ones designed in World War One. Theoretically, they're designed such that once the shooting starts, the captain of the ship and his staff should retire to the conning tower and command the ships from there. And the British especially, but also a number of other navies, the captains could take one look at that suggestion and go, no. And they stay right put where they are. So there tends to be a little bit of bunching up just as a result of that anyway. Because to be honest, I can perfectly understand why, having looked into what happens at things like the Battle of Tsushima, I think Conning Tower should just be renamed the Death Bell.
Yeah, it makes for a big target, right?
I mean,
if I may, I just wanted to give one or two closing arguments from YouTube, and then we have to look at the time, because it is getting on a little bit. Go, Taki, what you wanted to say?
No, I just wanted to pile on the conning tower, basically about the only time it worked for intended purpose of keeping the ship directed was the USS San Francisco at the night battle, and even then the commanding officer was actually out of it and was just shouting orders inside. But
so no, I was just going to point out that the guy Kaufmania, I think he's Eric Kaufman from YouTube, and he said he's very pleased with the response. He always thought that Moose/Moore had more influence in this battle, or could have, and the discussion has been enlightening and addressing others' roles. Thank you very much. And there was one more comment. Yes, Steve M said Beatty is a man who had fewer buttons tailored on his jacket because he was short. We're dealing with a mountain of insecurity, but I think that's enough BT bashing for today. I think no, because it's it's 10:15, and it's Friday night, and I think it's time for us to go home. But I want to say give a great shout out to our guests for coming in once again. Let me point out that Dr. Alexander Clarke will soon be releasing a book titled. That's where you jump in and tell me the title.
Tribals, Battles, and Darings.
Tribals, Battles, and Darings, yes. If you want to purchase this book, you can pre-order it now. If you're looking for where, if you go to our portal, to the very article about this very stream that we released last week, we actually, I don't know if you noticed it, but we actually plugged it there.
Thank you.
So if you go there, you can pre-order this book if you're interested in British destroyers. Thank you very much, Drachinifel. Watch his channel soon for a recap of the Battle of Dogger Bank in video form. You also want to plug a book?
Yes, well, this is not my book, but it is a very excellent book nonetheless. This is The Great War at Sea, Naval Atlas, by Marcus Faulkner, introduction by Andrew Lambert. It is a wonderful reference book. If you've got sick and tired of seeing endless maps that don't make sense, and that's why some of you may have noticed me checking off to one side during it, because as it suggests as a naval atlas, it has all sorts of wonderful, clear and well laid out maps and short descriptions of the various battles, including some very relatively unknown ones. And he also has one for World War II. So,
which I'm holding up.
Yes, there you go.
Which
so
definitely. Marcus is also on Twitter. He's, I think, Naval History War on Twitter. He is absolutely amazing. He is a really, really great lecturer at King's College London. He's one of the nicest guys you will ever meet involved in naval history, and he really does do good work.
When is he going to join us here?
Yeah.
If you invited him, I'm sure he'd come, because he does like World of Warships. He's the one who introduced me to it.
Okay, well, look, since we have you and you know him, please feel free to extend him an open invitation anytime.
Yes.
We will warmly talk about his books. Maybe he can give us something to show from it, and that would be excellent.
Yes, we'll definitely be happy to do that.
Yes, because we like interesting people, and more interesting people are good. And thank you very much to Taki for sacrificing his Friday night, even though he's been moving apartments. So maybe it was a welcome break. I'm not sure.
It was kind of welcome break, but the moving is done. As they say, it's better to burn down once than to move. But
yes. Well, look, I have to say, your apartment wasn't that large, and I don't believe you can't have that much stuff in there.
There was a lot, especially including books and board games, and obviously my PC. Luckily, the PC survived, and now I'm set up in the new place already. That was the first order of the day once the move was finished. So
nice. Okay. The author was Marcus. Sorry, somebody was.
Faulkner. Magnus
Faulkner.
Faulkner.
Yes.
Marcus Faulkner. Yes. Okay. So thank you very much to our guests for
Yes.
coming. I think we're going to wrap it up
Pleasure.
here. Our
Yep.
next episode next month is going to go to Asia, I believe. Let me quick. Taki, tell us about next month's episode.
I've actually now I can't check the Discord.
You can't take the Discord. You were the one who suggested it. I thought you just know.
I believe it would be the Battle of the Java Sea and surrounding
Ooh.
unpleasantness.
Yes, Battle of the Java Sea. Look,
Oh, battle.
Dr. Alex, if you want to join us again, I'd be happy to have you. It's up to you.
I'd love to be there.
So yeah,
I'd love to be there.
Battle of the Java Sea, and then in March we are currently thinking about talking about Cape Matapan. So that's what you've got to look forward to. As always, you can watch out for the Portal article at D-7, which will be for next month. This stream always happens at the last Friday of the month, barring unforeseen issues.
Yes.
So it'll be out on the 19th. You'll be able to ask questions there, or swing by the live stream and ask questions here. And for that, I think we're going to now say goodbye. Have
Yes.
a fantastic weekend. Remember that things are happening on the internet you should keep an eye on. It's going to be a fun evening, and I think maybe a fun weekend and a fun next week. And I'm certainly going to enjoy myself massively. And then, yeah,
Thank you.
that's it.
Yeah.
Any closing words, guys?
Been loving. If you're doing Matapan, there is one person I do suggest you should try and see if would come on, and that's our third colleague from Bilge Pumps, which is the podcast me and Drac do together. Jamie from Armored Carriers, Jamie Seedale. He is. Well, how would you describe his interest in Matapan, Drac?
He's interested in the Mediterranean operations generally.
He is. Yeah,
Okay.
he is amazing. He is really, really good at that.
So let's talk about that going forward, and I think that might be a cool idea. I will
Yep,
actually
definitely.
look. I'm going to make it official now. I'm going to officially invite Dr. Alexander Clarke to the hallowed Armchair Admirals Central Discord channel.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
So now you can be part of.
Warning:
part of the
sometimes there is a bit
conversation.
of insanity going on there, but
Slightly. Yes.
slight.
Yes.
That's
Okay.
fine. I love Discord. I have a Discord channel myself for my own
Amusement.
YouTube channel, and it's lovely. It's got all sorts of fun memes going on there at the moment.
Oh, okay. Then you will feel
We'll
like
have to have a look.
at home.
Okay, so then with that, have a great weekend. We're going to launch our traditional raid right now. Please go give some love to the fellow British man that we will be raiding. And yeah, we'll see you next week for our regularly scheduled stream on Thursday from 6 to 8 Central European time, whatever that may be where you are. And with that, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you.